This video, we're going to do a recap of all the topics we covered in Domain 1. You can use it as a recap for your notes when you're working on practice questions for the day before the exam or whatever else you need. So to recap, confidentiality is us protecting our information from unauthorized disclosure, and we can do that by using access control, file permissions, and encryptions. Now, if we don't do that, it can have negative impacts on our ability to compete. We can have loss of public confidence. There might be legal actions. We might be out of compliance. Those are going to cost us a lot of money and could potentially put us out of business. Then we have integrity. That is making sure that the data is accurate and complete. And again here, we can do that through access control, logging, hashes, digital signatures, backups, and encryption. Now, if we don't do that, that could lead to loss of compliance, hardware failure, fraud, inaccuracy, and losses. Again here, this could put us out of business. And finally, availability. That is authorized users not being able to access the resources and information they need to. Slightly different approach here. We still have access control, but we also have a lot of redundancy. We have high availability systems where it makes sense. We have backups, we have data replication, and then we have a good disaster recovery plan. Now, if we can't maintain our availability, well, then we won't operationally be effective. We lose production time, we might lose money, we might be out of compliance, and this could also lead to lawsuits and fines. IAAA, identification, authentication, authorization, and accountability. The identification is my username, my user ID, my employee ID, my name. I am Thor. Now that I claim I am Thor, now I need to prove it. That is the authentication. Here, we can do type 1, 2, or 3 authentication. Type 1 is something you know or a knowledge factor. Type 2 is something you have or a possession factor. Type 3 is something you are or biometrics. We want, on most things, multi-factor authentication. That most often means type 1 and type 2, but there are definitely scenarios where type 3 makes sense. Type 1 is the cheapest, it is the easiest to compromise, and it is the most widely used. Type 3 is most expensive, it has some unique challenges, and it is the only one we can't reissue. We can, of course, give you a new username and a password, we can give you a new passport, we can give you a new ID card, but we cannot replace your fingerprints. At least not that I am aware of. Then we talked about least privilege. We give the user exactly enough to do what they need to do, no more, no less. If they need to do anything outside of that, then we need to grant them more access. And least privilege is often used with mandatory access control. Then we have need to know. You get access to way more than you need to do your day-to-day job, but if you access the data, you have to have a need to know. It needs to be something that you need for your work. This is where if you are the doctor, you can access patient data for the patients you're treating. You can't just go browsing around and looking at patient files. Then we talk about discretionary access control. That is at the discretion of the owner. They can grant and remove rights, and it is the most widely used. Type 3 is most expensive, it has some unique challenges, and it is the only one we can't reissue. We can, of course, give you a new username and a password, we can give you a new passport, we can give you a new ID card, but we cannot replace your fingerprints. At least not that I am aware of. Then we talked about least privilege. We give the user exactly enough to do what they need to do, no more, no less. If they need to do anything outside of that, then we need to grant them more access. And least privilege is often used with mandatory access control. Then we have need to know. You get access to way more than you need to do your day-to-day job, but if you access the data, you have to have a need to know. It needs to be something that you need for your work. This is where if you are the doctor, you can access patient data for the patients you're treating. You can't just go browsing around and looking at patient files. Then we talked about discretionary access control. That is at the discretion of the owner. They can grant and remove rights. We talked about mandatory access control. That's the one where confidentiality is most important. We use least privilege, we use labels and clearance. Objects have labels assigned to them and subjects have clearance. That clearance needs to supersede the label assigned to the object for you to access it. And we talked about role-based access control. By far the most common type of access control today, and what you're going to see in most corporate environments. Rights are given to a role. That role is then assigned to anyone who has that position. The thing you need to remember here is we need to remove access if someone moves to another group. They get their old rights removed, they get the new rights added. And then as the last major model, we have attribute-based access control. Similar to role-based, but it also has attribute. And this is most likely what we're moving towards. It's much more granular compared to role-based access control because here we have the subjects and the objects, but we also have the environmental conditions. And then within the different types of access control we can also have context-based access control. That's the one where if I log in from my home PC, that IP is whitelisted, I log in within working hours, I get access. But if I log in from an entirely different country at 3 in the morning, I don't. Then we have content-based access control. Based on who I am, if I'm a doctor, I get one menu. If I'm a pharmacist, I get another. And then as the last part of the IAAA model, we talked about accountability, which can sometimes also be called auditing. We trace an action to a subject's identity. If someone logs in on my PC using my username and password, using my token for multi-factor authentication during working hours, I should be at the PC and delete files or steal proprietary information. It's going to be very hard for me to say I didn't do it, which is non-repudiation. I can't repute having done that. Privacy is a right, and as cybersecurity professionals, our balancing act is to keep enough information for whatever we are doing while still respecting the data subject's privacy. If the customer is in the US, we can collect a lot more, whereas if they're in the EU, we can't really retain anything unless it is necessary to do whatever we do. And in the EU, customers can request to have their data deleted, or they can ask to see which data we are keeping on them. And again here, this comes with some exceptions. Some things have to be kept for law enforcement. If it's a credit card statement, the customer can't call in and ask us to delete the statement. If we're the payment card processor, we have to have proof of the transaction. But outside of that, people living in the European Union have much stronger privacy protection compared to most of the rest of the world. And then, of course, most of the privacy we talked about in cybersecurity is PII, anything that can be used to identify you. Your name, your ID card, your license, your IP address, your home address, your car's license plate, something that by itself or in conjunction with other PII can be used to trace back to you. In risk management, we start with risk identification. And here it is important that all our assets are identified because if we don't know what we have, how can we possibly protect it? A threat is a potential harmful incident. A vulnerability is a weakness that can allow that threat to do harm. Remember, to have a risk, we need to both have a threat and a vulnerability. The equation is risk equals threat times vulnerability, and sometimes you'll hear both threat and vulnerability referred to as likelihood. You may also see that equation as risk equals threat times vulnerability times impact. For the exam, do you need to know all this? Probably, I would. I think it's an integral part enough of risk management that they may give you 1 or 2 questions on this. Then we have the total risk, that's the risk times vulnerability times the asset value. And then whenever we do mitigations, the residual risk is the total risk minus the countermeasures. In risk identification, we identify our risk management team, we decide what is in and out of scope, what specifically are we focusing on, and then know the acceptable levels of risk, which is basically the risk appetite that our enterprise has, and that is set by senior management. We then do the actual risk assessment. That's where we have the qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. Qualitative is quality. It's kind of vague. It's kind of a feeling. That's pretty good quality. Quantitative is quantity. It's a number. It's specific. That's where we put the numbers to the feelings from the qualitative risk analysis. Then we choose the recommendations for risk responses. That could be risk mitigation. We reduce the risk. We put in some sort of countermeasure. It could be risk transference or risk sharing. That is most likely insurance, but it could also be starting a new project with a 50-50 partner. Then we have risk acceptance. We know the risk is there. We have done the analysis, but the countermeasures just don't make financial sense. That was the $250,000 loss, but it's going to cost us $1 million to implement. We don't implement. We just accept the risk. Then we have risk avoidance. This is us not issuing the laptops. We know the risk is there. It's not feasible to do mitigation. We can't transfer. We can't accept the risk. Well, then we do risk avoidance. We don't issue the laptops, or we don't build our data center in an area that's prone to flooding. And those four are the only acceptable responses. Risk rejection is never ever okay. That's us knowing the risk is there, but not doing anything. We just kind of ignore it. That is negligence, and you are now liable. In the qualitative risk analysis, we use the risk analysis matrix. How likely is something to happen? How bad is it if it is? And then depending on that score, we go to the quantitative risk analysis on the ones that scored high enough. We put all our risks in a risk register, and whenever we treat the risk, we add it to the risk register, so if we have chosen mitigation, the risk score should be lowered. Now, if that is not lowered enough, well then we do another mitigation until the risk is at an acceptable level. We then covered the quantitative risk analysis. That's where you had to do a little math. We had the example with a laptop. The laptop was worth 1,000. The PII on the laptop, 10,000. If we lose the laptop, it's going to be gone. The exposure factor is going to be 100%. So the single loss expectancy, that is the asset value times the exposure factor, was $11,000. The annual rate of occurrence was how often do we lose the laptops? We lose 25 every year, meaning our annualized loss expectancy, or LE, is going to be $275,000. The countermeasure we chose to implement was full disk encryption and remote wipe capabilities. That's going to cost us $100,000. Since $100,000 is less than $275,000, or really $250,000, we choose to implement. We're still going to lose the laptops, right? We're still going to have that cost of $25,000. But the 25 times 10,000 for the PII we lost every time we lose the laptops, that is saved. And that is really how all risk management is done. We need a positive ROI. There's no point in spending $100 to making sure that $50 are safe. Then we talked about KGI, Key Goal Indicator. And goal was the overarching one. Then KPI, Key Performance Indicator, was the specific one. This task is doing this well. For us with risk management, these measures we have implemented are doing this well. They are within the baseline of where they should be. They're still functioning. And then we had KRI, Key Risk Indicator. And we use that to demonstrate a risk to the organization, something we're facing or something new we're starting to do. How risky is that endeavor? Then after the risk assessment, we do the risk response and mitigation. And remember, this is the only one that is due diligence. And this is where senior management has chosen to act on our recommendations or chosen something else. We now implement. That's where we do the mitigation, the transfer, the acceptance, or the avoidance. We then update the risk register to make sure that it is recorded which of the 4 mitigation strategies we chose and what it did to the risk number. Then we proceed into risk monitoring and reporting. We of course need to make sure that the risk responses that we implemented are as effective and as efficient as they need to be. We also need to monitor for new risks. We talked about administrative or directive controls. Those are our policies and our procedures. Then we had technical or logical controls. That's our hardware, software, firmware, but all that is configured based on our policies and our procedures that we got from the administrative controls. Then we have the physical controls. Those are the locks, the fences, the guards, the dogs, the bollards, all that stuff. Things you can physically touch. Again here, all things here are done based on our policies and procedures. Then we talked about the different access control types. Preventative, it stops something from happening. It prevents it. Detective, it detects an attack either during or after. Corrective, it corrects an attack. Recovery helps us recover after an attack. Deterrent, it deters an attack. That was the small offenses, right? It doesn't necessarily prevent anything, but it can make it less likely for something to happen. And then finally, we had compensating controls. They're the ones that were put in place. It's not feasible to do any of the others, but based on our security posture, we need to have something in place here. That was the guard at the fence. We talked about the differences between governance and management. And governance is senior leadership. It's the board of directors, our stakeholders. They have the vision, they set our mission, they provide us with the direction that the company needs to go in. They approve the policies. And keyword here is approve. Management normally makes the policies, senior management approves them. Senior management sets our risk appetite. That is where we can be risk averse, we try to avoid risks, or we can be risk aggressive. Both come with unique opportunities and threats. And then management will take the directions that is set by senior leadership, and with that we'll build our plans, implement and monitor whatever we need to go in the right direction. And then finally, we talked about the different roles. At the top of the organization, we have the CEO or the president. Depending on our structure above him or her, we can have the board of directors and our shareholders. Below the CEO, we have the vice presidents or VPs. Over the IT organization, that would be our CIO or CTO, Chief Information or Chief Technology Officer. Security sightings in IT, we would have a CISO or a CSO, Chief Information Security Officer, or just Chief Security Officer. In the ideal world, we would want the security function to be under the CEO and not the CIO or CTO. And we do that because we want to make sure that no favors are being played for IT. They need to be treated for our security as any other part of the organization. And then the final role we had was the CFO. They're the person that makes sure that we are financially viable, which is why our risk assessments are based on a cost-benefit analysis. We talked about criminal law. Here, society is the victim and the sentence is to punish and deter. With criminal law, proof must be beyond a reasonable doubt. Then we have civil law or tort law. Here, individuals, groups or organizations are the victims. The proof must be the majority of the proof, and it's financial fines to compensate the victims. Then we had administrative law. Those are the laws that are enacted by government agencies. In the US, that could be the FDA or the FAA. Then we had private regulations. The best example we have talked about was the PCI DSS, the rule that governs the issuance of credit and debit cards in the US. We talked about customary law, basically conduct and patterns of behavior that's found in tradition or customs in an area or a region. We talked about religious law. They're based on the religious beliefs of an area or a country, and they most often include a code of ethics and moralities that are required to be upheld. Then we talked about HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. That's the one where in the US, your health information is protected. Then we talked about security breach notification laws. In the US, all 50 states have them, but they are individually made by the different states, and some of them are pretty good and some of them are pretty bad. If data is compromised, they have to notify if it is unencrypted and if it's above a certain number. If it's 2,000, they might not have to notify, but if it's above 10,000, maybe they do. We talked about the ECPA, Electronic Communication and Privacy Act. The whole point here was that it would give people protection for their electronic communication against warrantless wiretapping. But with the Patriot Act of 2001, that was sort of erased. The Patriot Act expanded law enforcement's electronic monitoring capabilities, and it allowed for search and seizures without immediate disclosure. Then we talked about CFAA. That was the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and that is the one that we most often prosecute cybercrimes under. We talked about the PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. It's not a law, it's an industry regulation. And then finally, we talked about the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. And that governs all the people inside the European Union, regardless of where your company is. By far, one of the best privacy protection laws that we have seen up till now. And I spent a little more time on it because I think it's a good framework for understanding how privacy protection should be implemented. Our values are our ethics, our principles, and our beliefs. We use those to build our vision, which are our hopes and our visions, which then builds the mission, the motivation, and our purpose. And using all three of those, we then build our strategic objectives. We have different types of plans in an organization. The governance plans, the strategic plans are long-term plans. They're 3 to 5 years, but they are reviewed annually. From those, we build our management or tactical plans. They're normally 1-year plans. That's all our projects, acquisitions, hiring, and budgets. And then below that, we have the operational plans. That's the ones that the staff do. They are highly detailed and they're updated frequently. We talk about our policies. They are mandatory, they're high level, and they're non-specific. We have 3 different types. Regulatory, those are the ones based on laws. Advisory, those are the ones where we outline what is acceptable and what is not. And then we have informational, and they're really just there to inform people about things like our vision, our mission, our values. Using those policies, we build our standards. And here we are in great detail. This is where we'll have this operating system, this much memory, this type of switch that are specific, and using those standards, we then build our procedures or our processes. They are also mandatory, and these are the low-level, step-by-step guides on how to do something. That could be the server hardening. And with that, we are done with the Domain 1 recap. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next lecture. In this video, we're going to do a recap of all the topics we covered in Domain 2. You can use it as a recap for your notes, for when you're working on practice questions, for the day before the exam, or whatever else you need. Alright, let's recap. We talked about our BCP, the Business Continuity Plan, which focuses on how do we continue to function as a business or an organization during and after a disaster. We talked about how the BCP is the big overarching plan that covers the entire enterprise. And then below the BCP, we have a bunch of subplans. The most notable one is the DRP, the Disaster Recovery Plan, and we will start on that one in the next lecture. As some of the other subplans, we have our COOP, Continuity of Operations Plan. How do we continue to operate during the disaster? We have a Crisis Communication Plan. How do we communicate during the crisis and who is allowed to? We have a Cyber Incident Response Plan that deals with anything that is online. That is often part of the DRP. We have our Occupancy Emergency Plan, and many, many more. We talked about how our DRP and our risk management is tied closely together because it really is us going out and looking at all the potential risk scenarios and then building solutions for what if that specific scenario happens. And many of our mitigations and countermeasures can mitigate multiple different types of disasters. We talked a little bit about the differences between projects and operations. Projects are temporary, fixed time, fixed budget endeavors that moves us from where we are now to where we want to be in the future. Operations, on the other hand, is keeping the lights on. That is payroll, customer service, maintaining our servers, our software, all the things that we need to do to keep the status quo and do what we do now well. But operations does not move us forward. Then we talked about the business impact analysis. That again ties back to risk management. How affected are we if this happens? How affected are we as a business? And then we talked about the different tier systems that most places have. With tier 0, we may have no maximum tolerable downtime. Those systems have to be up 24/7, 365. Whereas with tier 4 systems, maybe we're okay with being down for a week. And of course, not to be confused with the Uptime Institute and their tiers for data centers. Then we talked about the 3 different disaster categories: natural, human, and environmental. Natural is it is earthquakes, hurricanes, naturally occurring fires. Human is something done by humans, and that doesn't mean it has to be intentional. It can just be someone doing something that they're not supposed to. They may not even know they're not supposed to, but the impact can be just the same. It's something that's done by people. And then finally, we have environmental, and that's all the things in our environment, our servers, our building, HVAC, UPS. It is not the environment. It is not nature. And we talked about how some things can be all 3, water or fire. Fire could just be a naturally occurring forest fire. It could be someone lighting our building on fire, or it could be equipment, environmental, that catches on fire. And then finally, we talked about how we need to update our BCP when our infrastructure, our systems, or a significant part of senior leadership changes. The first 2 make sense to most people. If we have changes to our infrastructure or our systems, we need to update the plan, because if we don't, we won't be able to restore those systems and we might not be able to use the infrastructure. And senior management makes sense because they are ultimately liable. They sign off on the plan, they own the plan. If 75% of them are not on board, they haven't signed the plan, well then we need to make a new plan that they can agree with. Maybe with that many people new in senior leadership, our direction changes. Well then the plan has to reflect that. We talked about disaster recovery planning, and here we have to answer at least 3 basic questions. What is the objective and purpose of the plan? Who are the people and teams responsible in case a disruption happens? And what do they need to do when we have a disruption? And then we'll talk about we need to be very clear on who can declare a disaster and the different levels of how bad it needs to be for something to be a disaster. We talked about the chain of communication. Who needs to inform who? And it mostly shouldn't be the IT team. We are busy fixing the problem, so we need someone on the non-technical side. Then we talked about the DRP lifecycle. We start with mitigation, and that is pre-disaster mitigation and preparation. That is all the plans we make, the education the processes, the training. Then we have the response. How do we react in the disaster? We follow the plans. Then we have recovery. How do we reestablish basic functionality? And how do we get back to full production? Then we look some more at the business impact analysis, the BIA. Here we looked at how do we make sure we have the right mitigations and right countermeasures in place. How can we make sure that critical systems recover in a timely manner? And we talked about how we can have recovery systems that are spec'd with minimum operating requirements. That is the exact minimum amount of hardware specs that we can get away with and still be functional. We then talked about disaster recovery sites. We had redundant sites. They mirror copy our primary data center, or at least the critical applications. In most places where I've seen them, they have been active pairs, meaning data is being processed on both servers in both data centers. Because there's really no point in having a fully spec'd data center just sitting there doing nothing. Then we had hot sites. Those were the ones where we only house the critical applications, and they're spec'd with the MOR, minimum operating requirements. It's still a full data with redundant PSs, PDUs, generators, HVAC, but it's a much smaller footprint. And at the hot sites, we would have near real-time or real-time copies of the data for those critical systems. Then we had a warm site, very similar to a hot site. All the hardware and the data center is the same. We have the same lower spec systems, but here we would need to bring the backups to the warm site and then do restores on the systems. And once that's done, we manually switch the traffic over to the secondary site. That can take between 4 and 24 hours. Times more. Then we had the old site, and that is the one where we only have the data center. We have the UPSs, the HVACs, the generators, everything else. We have the physical building, but we don't have any of the servers. We need to bring everything there, install it, configure it, add the applications, restore the data, and here recovery can take weeks. Then we also talked about reciprocal sites or reciprocal agreements. That is us having an agreement with someone else in the same line of business, and we then have 1 or 2 racks of our servers in their data center completely segmented off on their network, and they have the same in ours. They have to be in the same line of business because then we assume they're compliant with the same regulations that we have to be. Obviously, we need to confirm that. We also talked about mobile sites. Basically, a data center on wheels, most often in a container, either fully self-contained or we need to go hook it up to power and internet somewhere else. Here again, it's only the critical stuff, but it is a fully contained data center, HVACs, UPSs, generator, whatever. Backup sites are now options, and that can range all the way from minimum operating requirement systems that are not powered on to completely redundant sites that are on 24/7. The only difference here is it's at the cloud provider. What type we have depends on our needs, what we want to pay for, and how much downtime is acceptable. Then we talk about the lessons learned that we have to do after a disaster. There is so much information that we can use from this disaster to help to either mitigate or completely. Next one, what well, what did not work well, what can we improve, and then we use all that information in the next iteration of the plans. And then finally, we talked about some of the common pitfalls we need to avoid with our BCP and DRP. And most of these tie back to the first one, lack of support from senior leadership. Because if we don't have that, then we probably don't have support from the business units either. If we don't have that, we won't have the right staff involved, which means we either get a too narrow or too broad scope, so when something actually happens, we may not have all the systems available that we need for our critical business. And then of course we need to keep the plan up to date, and we need to have proper versioning. We can't just have Bob from home trying to fix something using the previous version. Either what he does nothing, or he breaks even more. Incident management is the monitoring and detection of security events on our systems. And then how do we react to those events? First off, we looked at the definitions. An event is an observable change in a state. It's not positive, it is not negative, it is just something happened. That can be traffic on a specific networking segment. It can be a server powering on, something changed in our environment. That is an event. Then we had an alert. That is a triggered warning when certain events happen. This is something we pre-configure. That could be networking traffic on this segment has above 75% bandwidth utilization for more than 2 minutes, or a server that uses above a certain threshold of memory for a certain amount of time. Then we had an incident, and that is when multiple adverse events happen on our systems or network. We had a problem. That is an incident with an unknown cause. So with this, obviously, we need to fix it, but we also need to understand how and why did this happen. Then we had an inconvenience or a non-disaster. Those are things in our environment that are down or broken, but since we have redundancy, the end user will notice. That could be the server that had the 3 disks in a RAID setup. If one disk fails, the other 2 are perfectly fine on their own. We obviously need to replace that disk as soon as we know it has failed, but there's no negative impact on the server or the traffic. The end user doesn't notice. Then we had an emergency. This is urgent. We need to do something about this right now. And many times this has to do with the protection of property or life. The next one up was a disaster. That is our entire facility being down or unusable for 24 hours or more. And that was the one that could be a snowstorm. It could of course be something more dramatic, but if our team can't work and can't work from home, we are unable to function for 24 hours or more. And then as the last definition, we had a catastrophe. That was where our entire facility was destroyed. Then we talked about NIST 800-61. That was the one that focused on the incident response lifecycle. We talked about the cyber incident response team, where we had to have that mix of senior management, the incident manager, the technical lead and teams, IT security, PR, HR, legal, and then after the fact, we might need an IT auditor and or a financial auditor. Because to handle the incident right, to make it less impactful, we need the right people. And then we finished out by talking about the 8 steps of incident management. We start with preparation, just like with any good project here. Again, we need the right stakeholders. We need to understand what exactly are we protecting, what is in scope and what is out of scope. Then we do detection, we realize we've been attacked, we respond, and that is when the incident response team starts working on the systems and we try to contain the damage as much as possible. Then we move into mitigation. Here we understand what happened, and since we have that clear understanding of what happened, we can both clean and restore the systems back into full operation. And we do that in recovery. But if we're not completely sure, it might a lot of times be smart to build a completely new server, load the operating system, the applications, and then only restore the data from the applications that we have on that server. Because a lot of the malware is going to be hidden on the system, so we do a clean install and just import the data. And this is way easier to do now than it was maybe 10 years ago. In many places, we don't use physical servers anymore. The servers are virtual. We still use a physical server chassis, but it is basically a giant, super powerful computer that we then segment into hundreds and hundreds of servers. The chassis is maybe the size of 5 regular servers, maybe 10, but it can hold hundreds, if not thousands of servers. So when we do the restore, we don't have to go out, find a physical standalone server, configure it, add the operating system, the applications. We can do all that remotely. We don't have to be physically in the data center. We can do it from our desk or we can do it from home. And here we need to make sure that we have that good backup. We need to make sure that what we are restoring with is not infected as well. If the vulnerability that caused the incident is well known, well then we need to find if there's a patch for it. If it is not a known vulnerability, well then we need to see what can we do to mitigate the damages from this vulnerability to make sure even with the vulnerability present, we are still secure. We then move into reporting, but really we start reporting all the way from detection to lessons learned. Because if we do it after the fact, if we start way later in the process, we're not really going to remember clearly what happened earlier. And in reporting, we have 2 main areas, the technical part and the non-technical part. The IT team handles the technical part. The other teams that are still involved in the incident, that could be HR, legal, human resources, senior management, they handle all the non-technical parts. Then we do recovery. That is where we very carefully restore the system or systems into their operational status. We can either put them in a sandbox or honeynet, but if they are critical systems, it's unlikely we'll have time for that. We might have to push them into production as soon as they are ready, but then we watch them very, very carefully for an extended period of time. We need to make sure that nothing was left behind by the attacker that they can use to access the systems. Then we have remediation. That's the one where we have fixed all the systems that were attacked, but we need to fix the same flaw on all the other systems we have to make sure they're not vulnerable as well. And then as the last part of incident management, we have lessons learned. Here we figure out what worked well, what did not work well, what can we do better next time, and we do that in-depth root cause analysis. So we can be very clear on what happened, how did it happen, and was there anything else we could have put in place, some sort of mitigation, that even with this vulnerability being present, we could have stopped the attack. That was the one where I used the example of we locked all the windows, but even with the windows being open, we could have used a motion sensor that could have alerted us if someone was in the building. And with That we are done with the Domain 2 recap. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next lecture. In this video, we're going to do a recap of all the topics we covered in Domain 3. You can use it as a recap for your own notes, for when you're working on practice questions, for the day before the exam, or for whatever else you need. So to recap, we've talked about physical security. We start out with our fences. That can be a deterrence or preventative depending on what type of fence it is. A 3-foot fence is a deterrence. An 8-foot fence with barbed wire is a preventative measure. Fences, and then in them the gates, are placed to control the entry and exit points from our perimeter. We want to make sure that people only exit and enter in 1 or 2 locations. Then we talked about bollards. Those are the ones that we use to make sure that cars or trucks can enter certain areas. They can be the metal posts, or they can just be big concrete planters that we have plants in. And bollards are a preventative measure. We talked about lights. They can be detective and deterrence. And we need to make sure that the whole area is fully illuminated. If we use French lights, the searchlights, either they need to be manual. If they're automatic, they need to be random or pseudo-random, so you cannot predict them. Then we talked about cameras. Most of us use CCTV cameras, closed circuit, but we can in some places use wireless IP cameras. Wireless is inherently much less secure. For the cameras, we want both a DVR, digital video recorder, and an NVR, network video recorder, just to make sure that we have all the camera footage somewhere safe and secure, not close to where the camera is. We talked about the exciting world of locks. They are preventative. How to a large extent, this also has to be through user training. You can of course pick a lock, or you can bump it, but it's much easier to borrow or steal the key. And then we talked about how we should only use combination locks in areas that need very low security. They're susceptible to brute force, they're susceptible to shoulder surfing. Someone could even put a camera just watching the lock, and whenever anyone punches in the code, they record it. And then of course over time they wear out, so it's pretty easy to see which combinations are used. Then we talked about smart cards. They can either be contact or contactless cards. Most of our credit cards today are both, meaning you can insert it in the chip reader or you can tap it on the payment terminal. Credit cards also have the magnetic stripes. Those are the same ones used for many hotel rooms. Super easy to copy. Then we talked about tailgating or piggybacking. It's basically following someone in someplace you shouldn't be. Now to prevent that, we can use man traps. Those were the ones where you enter a room, the door behind you locks, and you can't open door number 2 before door number 1 is completely closed. Some of them can also have pressure sensors, where they can see Bob is in the room, but this weighs way more than Bob. We check what else is in there, just to make sure no one else is in the room with Bob. Then we talked about turnstiles, preventative or deterrence. If it's a 3-foot one that you have on a subway, it's pretty easy to get over, but it's also a low security area. High security area, it would have the interlocking blades, and there's no way to jump over it. There would be a fence around it. And both of those are there to prevent tailgating or piggybacking. Both, of course, also needs to fail open. Then we talked about contraband checks. Most of us have been through those at the airport where we can't bring water on the plane, but really they look for a lot more, right? I'm probably just upset about losing my water one time. Then we had motion sensors. Most of those are light-based, but they can also be ultrasound, microwave, infrared, or laser. Pew pew! Everything except the light-based are active sensors, so they send some sort of energy out. That can be sound or wave or light. And if the return time on that signal is either longer or shorter than expected, it triggers an alert. Then we talked about walls, floors, and ceilings, doors and windows, how they need to be equally strong. For a data center, the walls need to be slab to slab, they need to have an appropriate fire rating, and they need to be strong enough. You could probably get a fine fire rating with a very flimsy door and a very flimsy wall, but for the data center, they also need to be strong enough, they need to be secure enough. Then we talked about guards, and guards is one of those things that can just be used for so many things. They can be deterrent, they can be detective, preventative, compensating. What type we use depends on what we need to protect and which other countermeasures we have not been able to implement, so we need the guards to compensate. Then we talked about dogs. Dogs are deterrent, they're detective, and they're compensating, but they also come with some unique liability issues. And then we talked about what do we do When we have someone authorized visiting our secure facility, do we escort them? Does a little Thor sit there for 6 hours and watch them while they work? And the answer where I worked was yes. We just spent a bunch of time on logical or technical controls. They are one of the three access control categories. The other two are administrative and physical controls. We have different access control types. They are preventative, detective, corrective, recovery, deterrent, and compensating. The names sort of tell you what they do. We talked about identity and access provisioning. Those were the ones where an entity can have multiple identities, and those identities can have multiple attributes. The example we had was, I'm Thor. I went to that college 10 years ago. I'm alumni. I'm going to the college again now. I'm a current student, and I'm also teaching at the college. So I have three different identities in their systems. Each of those identities have different attributes, different rights assigned to them, different things I can access. We talked a little bit about the identity and access provisioning lifecycle, which was what we could use to make sure that the password meets our compliance based on our policies, that we don't have inactive accounts, that new accounts that are created, if not used, will automatically lock. It really just is an automated tool that we can use to make the workflow for identity and access management much easier. Then we talked about federated identity and the subset of that, the single sign-on, where you can sign into one system and then have access to 20. Inherently less secure, but we can implement countermeasures to get us the security profile that we need. Then we talked about access control systems. When I swipe my card at a door, do I get access or not, which is based on my permissions. We can use centralized or decentralized. The centralized is more secure. It obviously needs to be on a hardened server, and the local admins from our satellite offices do not have access, but then the downsides could be traffic overhead or response times. To help with that, we can have a server at the satellite location where we just push the updates out. So even if that location has a poor internet connection or no internet connection at all, they can still do their work. And then every hour or whenever there's a change to the files, the update gets pushed out from the primary server at the main data center to the satellite location. Then we talked about how mandatory access control is what we use when confidentiality is most important, discretionary access control when availability is most important, and role-based or attribute-based access control when integrity is most important. We can use these in a minute. We can have role-based access control and discretionary access control within one system. That was where we talked about how we use role-based access control. You are a cybersecurity administrator. You have the cybersecurity administrator role and the rights that come along with that, but we can still use a shared drive that uses discretionary access control. And discretionary is the one that's based on the discretion of the data owner. They assign rights, they remove rights at their discretion. Mandatory access control, we have labels, we have clearance. The clearance have to supersede the label. We have labels on the objects and we have clearance on the subjects. The subject's clearance have to supersede the label. Then we have role-based access control. Depending on my job title, I have certain rights assigned, just like all the other people who have the same job title. Then we had attribute-based access control, similar to role-based, but we also here have environmental conditions. If I am a cybersecurity analyst, I don't have a need to get into the data center, so I don't have access. But if for some reason I'm working on a project for the data center team, and as part of that I need access, based on that environmental condition, I get access. Then we had context and content-based access control. Context is, well, based on context. That can be my login time, where I log in from a sequence of response or an access history. If I log in from a different country at 3 in the morning, I get denied access because that's not my usual pattern. Content, we hide and show data and menus depending on who accesses the system. Pharmacy sees entirely different things than a nurse would. And then we recap on least privilege, needs to know, and separation of duties. Least privilege, we give them exactly enough access to do the job, no more, no less. Need to know, you have way more access than you need, but you have to have a valid reason to look at the data. If you don't, there'll be consequences. Separation of duties is where a single task can't be completed without more than one person. Bob can both request the check and issue the check. Then we talked about job rotations and mandatory vacations. Both are used to detect errors and fraud. Job rotation, we move someone into another job for a certain amount of time, and it can have added benefits of trying something new and learning much more about the organization. And for the employees, you get a full picture of what we do. And the example I had where I was the IT manager, We implemented a bunch of improvements that were relatively inexpensive, saved us a lot of money because the IT team was able to go out, visit other departments, and find small things we can do to make their workflow better. With mandatory vacations, we don't ever tell them it's coming. We lock their accounts, then we go in and say, hey Bob, go on vacation for 2 weeks. And then we have someone else cover. And with any of these, we have no guarantee that we will detect the errors or the fraud, but it's more likely. Then we talked a little bit about NDAs, the non-disclosure agreements. Those were the ones where the employees agreed not to share critical or sensitive information about the business with anyone else. We talked about background checks, where we check their references, their degrees, employment, certifications. The more sensitive a position is, the more in-depth the background check should be. And for some positions, it should be an ongoing process. And then finally, we talked about data classification. Those were the ones where we had two different ones in the military and in the private sector. The military was top secret, exceptionally grave damage, secret, serious damage, confidential damage. Then they had that sensitive but unclassified, that was the payroll data, or PII, or PHI. And then finally, unclassified. And unclassified doesn't mean publicly available. You still need to request and be granted access. But if it gets leaked, it's not going to cause any major harm. On the private side, it was confidential, private, sensitive, and public. And here, public is websites and advertisements. Anything we make publicly available. And with that, we are done with the Domain 3 recap. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next lecture. In this video, we're going to do a recap of all the topics we covered in Domain 4. You can use it as a recap for your notes when you're working on practice questions for the day before the exam or whatever else you need. Alright, so let's recap. We talked about what a network is, how it is a set of computers sharing resources or data. Then we talked about simplex, half-duplex, and full duplex. Simplex is a one-way communication. Half-duplex, one side can send or receive. Think of that like a walkie-talkie. And then full duplex, both sides can send and receive at the same time. We talked about baseband and broadband. Baseband, we have only one channel and you can send one signal at a time. Our Ethernet is baseband. Then we have broadband. Here we have multiple channels that can all send multiple signals at the same time. We talked about how there really is no internet. It's just a global connection of peered WAN networks, ISP service providers, and long-haul providers. We talked about the intranet. That is our internal network in our organization. And if we either have a large organization or we have paired our internet with another organization in the field that we're in, that would be an extranet. Then we talked about circuit switching versus packet switching. Circuit switching was the one that was more expensive. Here we have a dedicated circuit. The traffic always takes the same path, whereas a packet switching network, which is what most people have and most organizations, here the traffic can take different paths through the network. Connections are often oversubscribed, and for TCP connections, the traffic is assembled at the destination. We can also use quality of service. That's the one where we give certain traffic priority, meaning if we use voice over IP or video conferencing or online gaming, anything that needs real-time or near real-time data transfer, we give that traffic a higher priority. Because for me as an end user, it doesn't matter if my website loads a quarter of a second later, but with the video conference, here it does matter. Then we talked about the different types of networks. PAN, personal area network, anything really you can reach out and touch that is in your vicinity. Then we had a LAN, local area network. Again here, it's connected devices and computers in a limited geographical area. Then we had a MAN, metropolitan area network. That is a large computer network that spans a city or a large campus. WAN, that was one of the components of the internet that we talked about. It's a computer network that covers a large geographical area. That can be a city, a country, or even intercontinental. And then finally, we have the GAN, Global Area Network. You can kind of hear from the name here, right? Global. It's the globe. And it doesn't have to be the entire globe, but it's very large networks. And we mostly use those to support mobile users across a bunch of different technologies. That can be wireless, satellite, phone connections. The important part here is that for the end user, it's completely seamless. I can't tell when I'm handed off from one network to the next. And then finally, we talked about VPNs, virtual private networks. And that was the one where we have that tunnel through the internet, giving us the feel and look of whatever location we're connecting to. If it is to your work, you'll be able to do the same things, have the same look and feel that you would have if you had been at your work location. Or you can just use it to get around geotagging. And that's where a service provider can see where your traffic originates from. Meaning, if I'm in Puerto Rico, I may not be able to access Netflix in Denmark. But if I use a VPN, they think I'm in Denmark, I can see the Danish shows. We talked about the OSI model, Open Systems Interconnect. We have the 7 layers, the physical layer, data link layer, network, transportation, session, presentation, and finally, the application layer. For the quick mnemonics, either from layer 7 to layer 1, all people seem to need data processing, or from layer 1 to layer 7, please do not throw sausage pizza away. Layer 1 was all the physical stuff, the wires, the fiber, the radio waves, the hubs, part of the networking cards. Here, data is ones and zeros. Layer 1 is also our topologies, bus, star, mesh, ring, and on layer 1, the threats were data emanations, theft, eavesdropping, sniffing, and interference. Layer 2 was the data link layer. We use logical link controls for error detection. This is also where we have MAC addresses. And layer 2 is sending data between 2 nodes on the same network. The first 24 bits of the MAC address was the unique identifier for the company. The last 24 bits was the unique identifier for that card. With 64-bit MAC addresses, the last card unique identifier was up to 40 bits. And those were the ones that were extremely easy to spoof. Threats on layer 2 was MAC spoofing or MAC flooding. On layer 2, we also have ARP, and while it's technically a layer 2.5 model, part of what happens on layer 2. Then we have CS, MA, CD, and CA. CD was the collision detection. That's what we used on Ethernet, and it's not something that's widely used anymore because we use switches, not hubs. Hubs is one big collision domain. Switches, every port is its own collision domain. Since it's only one port, there are no collisions. CSMA was wireless. And then finally we have token passing. It's the talking stick. If you have the talking stick, you are allowed to send. If you don't, you have to wait for it. Then we had layer 3. Here we move from a local network onto the internet. Everything here is IP-based, Internet Protocol. They can either be IPv4 or IPv6. We will cover those in a later lecture. On layer 3, we have all the protocols with ICMP, IP, IPsec, IGMP. The only one that starts with an I that is not layer 3 is IMAP. That is layer 7, and that's something we use for our emails. There are way more threats on layer 3 because here we leave our local network and we go onto the internet. We have ping of death, ping floods, Smurf attack, spoofing of source addresses, direct broadcasts, IP modifications, DHCP attacks, and many more. And we will cover all these attacks more in depth later. I just think it's important to understand that they are on this layer while we're talking about the OSI model. Then we have layer 4, that is where SSL and TLS starts, secure socket layer, transport layer security. There will be a lecture on that as well. What we have covered already was UDP and TCP. UDP is connectionless, it's unreliable, we use it for near or real-time data transfer. That is phone calls or voice over IP or gaming. The attacks against UDP would most often be fractal attacks, and they can be more successful than Smurf attacks because we normally always have UDP ports open, we don't always have ICMP. Then we have TCP that is reliable, it is connection-oriented, it guarantees delivery, it uses that three-way handshake, SYN, SYNAC, ACK, but because it has that guaranteed delivery, it resends the packets that don't make it to the destination, it's also slower and it has more overhead. And that was where the traffic is going to throttle up to a point where we start losing too many packages. Then the receiver is going to say, slow down. And the sender and the receiver will find out what is the optimal speed for us to send at without losing too many packages. Attacks here are SYN floods. The attacker sends the SYN, the server sends the SYNAC back, and sits there waiting for the last acknowledge. It never gets it, and here it's thousands or hundreds of thousands of clients doing that, eventually overloading the server. Layer 5 was the session layer. Here it establishes the connection between the two applications. It does the setup, the maintenance, and the teardown when we're done. Layer 6 is the presentation layer. It is the only layer with no protocols, and here we do the formatting, the compression, and even more important, the encryption, which then brings us to the last layer, layer 7, the application layer. That's where the data is presented to the user using their applications. And this is not the application themselves. It is the presentation of it. And here we have a bunch of protocols. HTTP, that is websites that are unsecure, port 80. we have HTTPS, secure websites, port 443. We have FTP, SNMP, IMAP, and POP. The last three here are the email protocols. And remember, IMAP is the only protocol with I that is not layer 3. And then the threats to layer 5 to 7 are viruses, worms, trojans, buffer overflows, and any vulnerabilities that are exploitable to our applications or our operating system. I hope this has helped you get a better understanding of the OSI model, and I understand this is a lot of information to take in. When I started my career in networking and I had to learn this, I have to admit it took a while. But at some point you get to, oh, right, that's layer 3, or oh, right, that's layer 5, and it's just second nature. I think you need to get to that point. I think it's worth the time and the effort. Watch the lectures as many times as you need, because there are going to be questions on the exam that mention something that happens on layer 4. Well, then you know it's UDP or TCP. It is segments. So spend a little extra time here, logic your way through it, take notes, do mnemonics, whatever works for you, because this is important enough. This is the foundation for all networking. We talked about MAC addresses. Those are the ones that are supposed to be unique identifiers for your networking card. Then I started my career in networking and I had to learn this. I have to admit it took a while. But at some point you get to, oh, right, that's layer 3, or oh, right, that's layer 5, and it's just second nature. I think you need to get to that point. I think it's worth the time and the effort. Watch the lectures as many times as you need, because there are going to be questions on the exam that mention something that happens on layer 4. Well, then you know it's UDP or TCP. It is segments. So spend a little extra time here, logic your way through it, take notes, do mnemonics, whatever works for you, because this is important enough. This is the foundation for all networking. We talked about MAC addresses. Those are the ones that are supposed to be unique identifiers for your networking card. The initial ones were 48 bits. The first 24 would be the manufacturer identifier. The last unique 24 would identify the host. On newer systems and on IPv6, we have to use 64-bit addresses. So for older systems, we just add FFFE in the middle, whereas any newer system is automatically having that 64-bit MAC address. Again here, with a 64-bit, the first 24-bit are the unique manufacturer identifier. The last 40 bits is the unique host identifier, but they are super easily spoofed. Then we talked about IP addresses, how it was first deployed into production with ARPANET in 1983. That is later what became the Internet. It was inherently not secure because it was built for secure closed networks. And IPv4 initially was a connectionless protocol, because again, there was no point in adding overhead, making it connection-oriented. It was just going from one device to another, which is the reason why we have so many support protocols to give us the speed, the delivery, and the security that we want online. The switch from IPv4 to IPv6 has been happening in the last 10 years because there's only about 4 billion IPv4 addresses. And right now, we have 22 billion devices online, and in 2025, we'll have about 75 billion, which is why we need to move to IPv6 that has so many more addresses. Remember, every square foot on the entire planet, or 30 by 30 centimeters, can get 65,000 IP addresses all to itself. We talked about how we have IP addresses and ports, and the IP address was the apartment building, the street number, where the port is your apartment number. That way, when you go to a website, it knows exactly which tab to load your data in. Then we talked about the well-known ports, 0 to 1023, the registered ports, 1024 to 49151, mostly used for vendor-specific applications, and then the private, dynamic, or ephemeral ports. They were 49,152 to 65,535. They can be used by anyone for anything. Then we briefly talked about the ports you probably need to know for the exam. Port 20 and 21 is FTP, port 22 is SSH, port 23 is Telnet, but that is unencrypted information. We should never use unencrypted plaintext. Then we had 25, 110, and 143. Those were the email protocols. We have port 80 and port 443. Those were websites, HTTP or HTTPS. 137, 138 is NetBIOS. And then finally 3389, the Microsoft Terminal Server, RDP, Remote Desktop Protocol. We talked about how an IPv4 address is made up by a dotted decimal. That was the 172.16.254.1. But what the computer reads is 10101110. For us, that's obviously not that easy to do, so we have the dotted decimal. If you're working in networking, you'll see a lot of IP addresses like that. For the end user, they just go to google.com and never know the IP address. They don't have to. Then we talked about public and private addresses. Public addresses, which is most of the address space, is internet routable. That is what my website has. That is what you have at home on your router. The private addresses is what we use on our internal network. So if we take the example of your router, the one you get your internet connection from at home, it has a public IP, that is the one that faces your internet service provider, and then on the internal side, it has a private IP range. That can either be the entire 10 network, 172.16.0.0 to 172.31.255.255, or the one I've seen used the most is 192.168.0.0 to 192.168.255.255. Then we looked a little at IPv6. IPv6 is 128-bit, where IPv4 was 32-bit, and IPv6 uses hexadecimal, meaning it uses 0 to 9, but it also uses A to F. An IPv6 address is made up of 4 groups of 4 hexadecimals. An important part of IPv6 for us is that IPsec is designed into the protocol and not just something we added later like we did with IPv4. We talked about the Address Resolution Protocol, ARP. That's the one we use to map our MAC addresses to IP addresses, where a device on the local network sends out, does anyone know the physical address, the MAC address, for this IP address? Not built to be secure, anyone can reply back, and if someone malicious replies back, that is ARP poisoning. And to mitigate some of that, we can hardcode some of the important ARP entries. That could be our default gateway. Reverse ARP is used by disk-class workstations. They send out, hey, this is my physical address. The server replies, well, if that is your physical address, here is your IP address. Then we talked about ICMP, how we use it for pings. We send those out to see if a system is up. Even if we don't get a reply, that doesn't necessarily mean the system is down. They could just, somewhere on that path, have blocked ICMP replies. We also use ICMP for trace routes. That was the one where we send a request out with a time to live of 1. As soon as it hits the first router, we get the IP address of that router. The router tells us you have a time exceed. It drops the traffic. We then send one with a time to live of 2, and then 3, and then 4. So we identify every single router on the way to where we're going. And it keeps doing that until it goes past 30 hops, it reaches the destination, or it hits somewhere where ICMP is blocked. Then we talked about HTTP and HTTPS. Those are the protocols that we use to transport HTML data. HTTP is not secure, HTTPS is. They use port 80 and 443. And HTML was the hypertext markup language. That is what websites are written in. That is the actual data. HTTP and HTTPS were the transport protocols. And then finally, we talked about DHCP. That is what we use to assign IP addresses. They can either be dynamic or static. We use dynamic for anything we put on our network where we don't care if it has the same address every time. If we have a critical server or a critical device, we would use the same static IP every time, and on the DHCP server, we would make sure that the static IPs are excluded from the pool of dynamic IPs. If they're not, well, that's just trouble waiting to happen. We talked about copper Ethernet cables, which is what most people think when you say networking cable, because that's what they're used to. We talked about EMI, crosstalk, and attenuation, which can all be issues with copper Ethernet, but not with fiber. Then we talked about how the cables are twisted in pairs, and they can either be unshielded or shielded. Unshielded is cheaper, that's what most cables are. Shielded is more expensive, they're stiffer cables, and we would use those in places where security is more important and where we don't want the EMI and the crosstalk. Then we talked about fiber cables. They can either be single mode or multi-mode. Single mode is a single strand, multi-mode is multiple strands, and they can send much faster than copper Ethernet. They have no attenuation, they have no crosstalk. You can't just clamp a sniffer on a fiber cable, but they're also more difficult to use, they're more expensive, and if you break the little glass strand in the middle, the cable is unusable. And then finally, we talked about Cat 5, 6, and 7, which is most likely what you're going to see for copper Ethernet. OM 3 and 4, what you're going to see for multimode fiber. And then that the speeds that we measure the internet connections in and the cable's ability to send is measured in kilobits, megabits, gigabits, terabits, and petabits. Every time we go a step up, we multiply by 1,000. In our LAN technologies, we mostly use Wi-Fi and Ethernet. Ethernet are cables, Wi-Fi is wireless. We talked about some of the legacy LAN topologies, the bus, where it's just like a string of Christmas lights. If anything breaks on that chain, there's no traffic going either way past that break. Then we talked about the tree topology, an upgraded version of the bus topology. There's a central node at the bottom, but again here, if any device breaks anywhere on that chain or the cable is bad, there's no traffic going either way. Then we have the ring topology. It's in a ring. So even if my connection to the computer to my left breaks, I can still send it all the way around to the right. Not super efficient, but still better than a tree or bus topology. Then we have the topology we actually use today. We have the star topology. That is where our switch is in the middle, and each of the nodes have one connection to the switch. Since this is its own collision domain, there are no collisions. And obviously, with a normal switch, if it's a large one, it's not just going to have 5 nodes. Normal switches that you would see in your work environment would be 12, 24, 48 for regular switches, and then some of the larger ones can be up to 1,000 ports. And then finally, we have the mesh topologies, partial or full mesh. The partial was where not all nodes are connected to every other node. Full mesh, every node is connected to every other node. And we do that for redundancy and load balancing. We talked about Wi-Fi or wireless, that you may see on the exam as wireless LAN or WLAN. And we kind of all know what that is, right? You connect to a wireless access point, and then you can move seamlessly around the building or the location that you're at. That can be your house, your school, or your work. But it is a geographically limited area. Then we talked about some of the threats, the rogue access points. Those are the fake access points that either can be malicious or non-malicious. It could just be that Bob doesn't have proper Wi-Fi coverage at his workstation, so he brings in a Wi-Fi access point from home. It could also be interference or jamming. That can both again be malicious or non-malicious. It could just be the microwave or baby monitor. Or it could be someone trying intentionally to compromise our integrity and our availability. And then we had an evil twin. They can either be internal or external. Internal is connected to our internal network. External is, well, not. And they're just a step up from the rogue access point. Here, they name the same Wi-Fi name that our company uses. So whenever one of our employees is in range and they have the best signal, they will most likely connect to that access point because it doesn't have a password. We talked about Bluetooth. Bluetooth uses the 2.4 GHz band. We use it for PANs, personal area networks, and even though Class 1 Bluetooth can reach up to 100 meters or 300 feet, most of the ones we use them for something that we can reach out and touch. Bluetooth is somewhat security through obscurity. First off, because it's not a very interesting target. Secondly, you need to be very close to the device to actually try to hack it. We talked about bluejacking. That is sending unsolicited messages over Bluetooth. Blue snarfing, that is where they access information of the Bluetooth device. And blue bugging, they gain control over your device. But blue bugging is only feasible on older cell phones that have not been updated. Any newer cell phone that gets automatically updated is not susceptible. And really here, all the countermeasures are common sense. Turn off Bluetooth when you don't use it, pair your device, then stop pairing, and don't accept pairing requests if you didn't send it. Then we talked about Li-Fi that uses light to transmit data. We talked about ZigBee. Here, it was a mesh wireless network with low power, but also very low data rates. Then we talked about satellite. It used to be really slow, really expensive, very high latency, but with Starlink, you can actually get very fast speeds, low latency, and a reasonable price. And for my use case, when the entire power grid is out in all of Puerto Rico, I can still have an internet connection because it's not reliant on any of the infrastructure here. And then finally, we talked about cell networks, how it's a regular backbone internet connection all the way up to the tower. From the cell phone tower to your device, it's wireless. It's called a cell network because it's made up of little cells. They should, just like our Wi-Fi, overlap so the end user never notices when they go from one antenna to the next. And then we talked a little bit about the 3, 4, and 5G bands. I don't think you need to know the speeds. Just understand that 3G and 4G has huge coverage areas. 5G does not, but it also has way higher speed. We talked about VLANs, how they're logically segmented LANs on our switches, and since we can have that logical separation, we don't need to have a different hardware device for each segment on our network. Now in our example, we had the VLAN for payroll that spanned 2 buildings, so the switches between those 2 buildings, they would have that VLAN enabled, but they would not have any other VLANs enabled. So on those trunk ports, between switch 1 and 2, we would have VLAN 3, but we would not have VLAN 1 and 2 or 23. And the way we make VLANs work is we configure the VLANs on the port. So if someone in accounting is going to use that port, then we add that port to VLAN 1 and VLAN 23 because they need to use voice over IP as well. And then the packets we send, they get tagged with those VLANs. For voice over IP phones, we give that traffic higher priority because it needs to be real or near real time. It's phone conversations. And we do that using quality of service. A regular switch has up to 4,094 VLANs and they have 12-bit VLAN IDs. And that's going to work in almost all places except large cloud providers, because they can easily have hundreds of thousands of customers that need their own VLAN. So for that, we have VXLAN. Here, they can have 16 million unique VLANs, and they have a 24-bit VLAN ID. On top of that, they also use MAC and UDP encapsulation, which means that we can extend layer 2 across multiple locations. It really just is an encapsulation protocol that runs on our existing layer 3 infrastructure, meaning we extend the VLAN across multiple locations so I can have my data in multiple data sensors and still be on the same VLAN. And then we finished out this lecture by talking about routers. Where switches can have up to 500 ports, routers have very few because they have an entirely different function. Their task is to route our traffic between different locations, whereas the switch is for our internal network and for all of our devices to be plugged into, so they have a connection. The router that you have at your house is the one box, where in most cases it combines a router, a switch, and a wireless access point. The router is where you plug in your cable from the internet service provider, then you have 4 or 8 ports, that's the switch, and then you have the wireless. On corporate routers, they don't have all that. It's just a router. And since routers are layer 3 devices, that means that they forward all traffic based on source and destination ports and IPs. Routers are what we use to connect our local area network to the wide area network. And on the inside of a router, the router itself would have a private address. On the outside, it would have a public address. And all routers have a routing table that basically tells that router, this traffic going to this destination, this is the best path. That is where I need to send it. That can either be something we configure statically, meaning we configure all traffic going to this network or to this segment is going out that port. It can also be a default route. That's us saying all non-local traffic, meaning all traffic going to the internet, gets sent out this port, and we use that for things we send to our internet service provider, because everything that goes to the internet has to go through the provider. There's no point in having a routing table that the router has to look up where to send this traffic. The router sees it's a public address, meaning it's going to the internet, it sends it to the internet service provider. Then the internet service provider has a huge routing table that figures out what is the best route to this destination. And then the final way we can learn routes is through routing protocols. That's basically different routers talking together, figuring out this is the best route to go to whatever destination, and since they share that information, they have a logical map of what are the best paths for whatever we're sending to that destination. With distance vector routing, you can kind of hear it right, distance. It only cares how many routers are in between here and the destination, which is not really how we want to send traffic. We don't care how many routers are there. We want the fastest path, which is why we use link state routing. Here traffic is going to get sent to the destination using the fastest path, regardless if there are 6 or 16 routers. We talked about VPNs. I am clearly a fan. They have helped me work from home for close to 15 years. They can give us a much stronger security profile online. We can avoid some geo restrictions, and really a VPN is just a tunnel through the actual internet and unsecured network that has end-to-end encryption from your system to the target system to wherever you're going. If that is your work network, then all your internet traffic, everything that you do, is going to go through your work network. And your look and feel is going to be exactly the same that you would have if you had been at the work location. Then we talked about third-party connectivity. It's not really something we can avoid unless we're a giant organization. And I'm talking Amazon or Google here, because we just don't have the capacity to develop all the applications that we need. So for that, we use third-party connectivity. And they then have some sort of access onto our network. We of course want to make sure that their systems are secure enough for whatever we're doing, and that they only have access to the things that their specific application needs. No more. They have least privilege. For those vendors, we have contracts, we have service level agreements, we have interconnect security agreements, and we have MOUs and MOAs. The MOU is us agreeing on a bunch of things. Yes, we understand this is our responsibility, where the MOA, they accept that responsibility. That is legally binding. The interconnection security agreements, ISA, is when we connect our two networks, we would also want some sort of rights where we can audit their systems and maybe even acceptable. We talked about software-defined networking here, and then the final way we can learn routes is through routing protocols. That's basically different routers talking together, figuring out this is the best route to go to whatever destination, and since they share that information, they have a logical map of what are the best paths for whatever we're sending to that destination. With distance vector routing, you can kind of hear right distance. It only cares how many routers are in between here and the destination, which is not really how we want to send traffic. We don't care how many routers are there. We want the fastest path, which is why we use link state routing. Here traffic is going to get sent to the destination using the fastest path, regardless if there are 6 or 16 routers. We talked about VPNs. I am clearly a fan. They have helped me work from home for close to 15 years. They can give us a much stronger security profile online. We can avoid some geo restrictions, and really a VPN is just a tunnel through the actual internet and unsecured network that has end-to-end encryption from your system to the target system to wherever you're going. If that is your work network, then all your internet traffic, everything that you do, is going to go through your work network, and your look and feel is going to be exactly the same you would have if you had been at the work location. Then we talked about third-party connectivity. It's not really something we can avoid unless we're a giant organization, and I'm talking Amazon or Google here, because we just don't have the capacity to develop all the applications that we need. So for that, we use third-party connectivity, and they then have some sort of access onto our network. We of course want to make sure that their systems are secure enough for whatever we're doing, and that they only have access to the things that their specific application needs. No more. They have least privilege. For those vendors, we have contracts, we have service level agreements, we have interconnect security agreements, and we have MOUs and MOAs. The MOU is us agreeing on a bunch of things. Yes, we understand this is our responsibility, where the MOA, they accept that responsibility. That is legally binding. The interconnection security agreements, ISA, is when we connect our two networks, we would also want some sort of rights where we can audit their systems and maybe even do penetration testing. And then we talked about service level agreements. That is where we outline the service we're buying from them, what are the acceptable parameters, how much uptime do we need. If this is a software as a solution, SaaS, well then we need this amount of uptime. We need this much warning before they have a downtime. If they exceed those parameters, well then there's some sort of reaction. They give us some money, or they give us months off, or whatever. And then finally, we talked about NAC, or Network Access Control. And that really makes sure that our environment and our systems in it adhere to our security policies. And NAC can both detect and respond. Because having those amazing, wonderful security policies really mean nothing if they are not followed. So the NAC can help us reinforce that the policies are followed, giving us a better security posture that then allows us to stop most of the known attacks and some of the zero-day attacks. And that really is the key here, right? We bring the risk down to an acceptable level. We can never get rid of the risk, but we bring it down to a point where that's acceptable. We talked about software-defined networking. Here, we use software to control the traffic through our network instead of hardware as we normally have. In doing that, we can control, change, and manage our network behavior dynamically, which gives us much more flexibility. It's much easier to change how we move our traffic, and we do that by separating the router's control plane from the data plane. That is where the routing decisions are made in the control plane, and the data plane forwards the data. It also allows us to be vendor agnostic. We don't have to have all Cisco equipment at our facility because it's no longer the hardware or their associated softwares that control the data flow. We do it through our own software. Then we talked about software-defined WAN. Here, instead of having MPLS connections like many companies have had for many years, we have a software solution that doesn't care what kind of connections we have. We don't pay for the capacity on the internet connections. They're just our regular internet connections, and we can use whatever is available in each location. On top of it being faster, much cheaper, it also has a near real-time failover, so if our primary connection goes down, the secondary is going to take over right away. It also makes it much easier to manage. It gives us better insight, better reporting, better statistics. And it's also easier to configure security. It really is just a better solution, which is also why there's that huge move of 85% plus of companies either have deployed or plan to deploy SD-WAN within the next 2 years. And software-defined doesn't just have to be WAN or network. It really can be so many things. It can be storage, it can be data center, it can be compute, it can be security. It really can be anything. And we're seeing that move as well with anything else, because it can help us manage our environments and everything that we do much, much easier. But here again, of course, we need to make sure that we have the right security profile, because we know making something easier often also makes it inherently less secure. We talked about hackers. They used to be someone who would find unique ways of using something for something it was not intended for. But now the use is more someone who's trying to gain access to or disrupt any leg of the CIA triad. That is our confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The hackers range from white hat to black hat hackers. White hat are ethical hackers. These are the people who are trying to find the flaws so we can protect our systems. On the other side of the spectrum, black hats also trying to find the flaws, but for entirely different reasons. These are the attackers. And then in the middle there's a spectrum of gray hat hackers. They're also trying to find the flaws, but they won't exploit them. They will either tell the company, you have a problem, please fix it, or we're going to publish it, or they're just going to publish it. The downside here is, as soon as they publish that flaw, all the attackers know it's there, and the company doesn't have time to prepare a patch. And then we have the term script kiddie. You can download some amazingly dangerous tools online today. You can do an incredible amount of damage, and it doesn't really require a lot of skill. Those are script kiddies. Then we talked about how there are many more external threats, but because of our layered defense, a lot of times they're not going to be as effective, whereas with the internal threats, because they have gotten through our outside layered defense, regardless if it's malicious or not, they're still going to have a higher chance of succeeding. We looked at lost or improper disposal of data was 6%, internal theft is 8%, employee actions or mistakes 24%, and all of those, to some extent, can be minimized with proper training and education. Then we have vendors 14%, external theft 17%, malware, hacking, and phishing 31%, and some of that can also be mitigated by raising the awareness of our internal employees, but a lot of what we need to do here is also technical. We talked about hacktivism and state-sponsored hacking. Hacktivism is for cause, something they believe in, really depends on your values and your opinions. Then we had state-sponsored hacking. This is a 9-to-5 job in more than 120 countries in the world, and many of the countries that doesn't have that, it's not because they don't want to, it's because they don't have the capacity. We talked a little bit about bots and botnets. The bot or the zombie is the individual infected computer. Then above that we would have the bot herder, and that could have 10,000 zombies. Above that, that could be another herder and another herder. So sometimes botnets can be in the millions. They're run through a CNC network, command and control, and normally the attacker would go through multiple secure links before they actually get to the first bot herder. The more degrees of separation, the less likely it is that the attacker is going to get caught. Then we talked about malware, and that's really the catch-all name for any malicious software that's used to compromise our systems or our data. We talked about viruses. They have to have some sort of human interaction. We talked about macro viruses. They're embedded in a document Word, Excel, PDF, whatever. Once you click on that attachment, you open the real attachment, but when the macros run, your system gets infected. Then we talked about boot sector viruses. If we look at a regular PC, it has two operating systems. It has the lower level operating system, the BIOS, that starts before the operating system you see. If you can infect that, well, even if you clean the regular operating system, it's still going to reinfect every time you start the computer. Then we talked about stealth viruses. They're trying to hide themselves from our antivirus software and from our operating systems. We talked about polymorphic viruses. They're changing their signature, trying again to avoid detection from our antivirus. And then we talked about multi-part viruses. They spread across multiple vectors. If they're in 3 places and we clean them in 2, at some point it's going to replicate out to the other 2 locations again. Then we talked about how antivirus software can be signature-based and behavioral-based, or heuristic. Any antivirus now is going to be both. The signature-based looks for all the known malware signatures that we have. They are in the millions. And the heuristic or behavioral-based system looks for any abnormal behavior on our system, anything that's not normal. But that can also lead to a lot of false positives. Then we talked about worms, how they spread through self-propagation, meaning they don't need any human interaction. They have both the payload that's going to do the actual damage to our systems, and then they have the part that's going to replicate as much as they can throughout our entire network, which also makes them easier to spot. And then we talked about Trojans. Just like the Trojan horse, the malicious payload is hidden. That could be you downloading a game. You get the real game, but within that game there's also the malware. And then finally, we talked about remote access Trojans. They're just regular Trojans, but once they have infected the system, the attacker has admin access. We talked about intrusion detection and prevention systems. They can be network-based, meaning they sit on a specific segment of our network and inspects all the traffic there. They can also be host-based. Here, they are on the end host, that is a server or a workstation. They inspect all the local traffic, and they can sometimes see things that the network-based can't, because we decrypt traffic on layer 6 of the OSI model, so that happens on the local system. On top of having 2 different types, we also have 2 different types of engines. They can either be signature or pattern matching. Here, all known malware and malicious traffic has certain signatures. We match the traffic against those. This is good because it's easy to install, it's easy to configure, and someone else does all the profiles for us. But that's not enough. That only catches everything that we know about. So to help with all the stuff that we don't know about, we have heuristic-based or behavioral-based engines. And here we monitor against a baseline. This is what normal traffic looks like. Anything outside of that we will alert on. Now the downside here is it can easily alert on regular traffic. Or what if we were already compromised before we built the baseline? If the baseline is built while we're compromised, then being compromised is going to be the new normal. It's not going to detect anything. And on most systems today, intrusion prevention and intrusion detection systems, we have both. It is a hybrid. We inspect both with the signature-based engine and the behavioral-based engine. And then on top of that, we send all that data back to our SIEM or source system to give us that full overview of everything, because the host-based system just sees what happens on that one host. The network-based system just sees what happens on that network segment. We need to see everything. And since the attackers most often are smart people, they will of course try to avoid being detected. So they can extrapolate the data they send. That can lower the chance of us detecting it. They can avoid defaults. Maybe we are used to seeing a certain attack on a certain port as TCP traffic. Maybe the attacker can send it on a different port as UDP traffic. They have avoided the defaults. They can also do low bandwidth coordinated attacks. This could be the botnet we talked about earlier. You have 10,000 hosts just scanning one workstation or one server. The attacker is still going to get the same information that they would as if they had scanned the entire network with just one attacking system, but since the attack originates from 10,000 different systems, they may avoid detection. Now our SIEM or our source systems should see this. And then the last big part of this lecture was the true and false, positive and negative. And here this really is a mind shift. And here you need to think of positive and negative not as good or as bad. You need to think of it as a rule being matched. If it is positive, then a rule is being matched. If it is negative, then no rule is being matched. And then the true and the false, is it identified correctly or wrongly? So a true positive, a rule is being matched, and it is identified correctly, this is an attack. If it is a true negative, no rule is being matched, there is no attack, the system is doing what it's supposed to. Whereas with a false positive, a rule is being matched, but there is no attack. It is identified incorrectly. The false negative, there's no rule that's being matched. It is an attack that is identified incorrectly. I hope that makes sense. We use SIEM and source systems to collect all the data that we have from all of our endpoints. That can be our routers, switches, firewalls. It can be the intrusion detection or prevention systems. It can be our data center, our heating, our air conditioning, our HVAC, our UPSs, our servers, sometimes even our workstations. We collect all the alerts, all the events from all those systems in a central location, and in most places, this is still done by SIEM systems. The last 15 years or so, everywhere I have worked, we have used those, but there is a gradual switch to source systems because they do everything that the SIEM system does, but on top of that, it also has an AI analytics engine, and it can integrate with other solutions. That could be our vulnerability management system, our threat intelligence, our IT service management. So it really just is a better solution that does everything that the SIEM system did. We talked about how firewalls are an established barrier between a trusted, secure internal network and an untrusted external network like the internet. We looked at some other legacy firewalls. We had packet filtering. It didn't care about the actual content of the packet. It just checked, is this traffic from this source IP to this destination IP allowed? If it is, we send the traffic through. If not, we drop the traffic. Then the next progression was stateful filtering firewalls. Here, we still had the access lists, but on top of that, we also had a state table entry. If I establish a connection out of our network, then that outside server is allowed to send traffic back to me. Then we talked about a proxy server. It's really just a relay. I send whatever I need from the internet to the proxy server. The proxy server then accesses the internet, gets the data, and then once it has that, it sends it back to me. But that proxy server is very, very hardened. Then we had application layer firewalls. And since you remember, traffic gets decrypted on layer 6, and since the application layer is layer 7, we can now see the full unencrypted traffic. And they can, just like our IDS and IPS, be network-based or host-based. We need to have both because they serve unique different purposes. Then we talked about next-generation firewalls and DFW. They can do all the same stuff that the earlier versions can do, but they also have a deep packet inspection, meaning we don't just look at the header, we look at the full package, the actual payload of the data, and they can also have network security systems. That can be intrusion detection or prevention systems. That can be malware filtering or antivirus. And then finally, we looked at DMCs, demilitarized zones. We could have a three-legged DMC, where each of the three legs will go to the internet, the internal network, and then some hardened servers, but that really gives us that single point of failure. What we really want is 4 firewalls from 2 different vendors. So one vendor is the external firewalls, one vendor is the internal firewalls. That way, if there's a vulnerability to either of the sets that is exploitable, it's not going to compromise all 4. And we want those 4 firewalls in a full mesh, so if any of them crashes, we can still pass traffic. And if a firewall crashes, it should always fail secure or closed. Those are words for the same thing. It is more important that we protect our internal network than it is that we have access to the outside. We talked about zero-day vulnerabilities. Those are the actual vulnerabilities that have not been widely discovered and published. Then using that vulnerability, the attacker would make a zero-day exploit. That is the code using the vulnerability, and the attacker would then use that code in a zero-day attack. Since this is the first time we see this attack, we don't have any signatures in our antivirus, IDS, or IPS. We can get lucky that the behavioral engine catches it, the heuristic system, but there are no guarantees at all. I would even say it's unlikely. And then we talked a little bit about a worm that used 4 zero-day exploits, the Stuxnet worm. It had the worm that would propagate throughout the systems. Then it had a link that would automatically execute the propagated copies of the worm. And then it had a rootkit that would only activate whenever very specific conditions were met. It had to be Siemens Step 7 PLCs. And the worm was successful. Even though it infected hundreds of millions of devices, it only wanted to get to that one specific device that was controlling the Iranian nuclear centrifuges. The facility was air-gapped like it should be, but an engineer brought it in on a USB stick. We locked down USB ports, we changed our users' behavior so they don't do things like that. We use vulnerability scanners and testing to test a single system or set of systems for known vulnerabilities. They have a long list of vulnerabilities and they then scan the systems for those. We can either do it on our production environment or we can do it on new servers before we put them into production. is something we do after the server hardening. And then the vulnerability scanning system will look through a predefined list of vulnerabilities. That can be system configuration, outdated software, lack of patching, ports that shouldn't be open, accounts that should be deleted, really most of the stuff we do in server hardening. And then once the scan is done, we get a report like the one over here on the right, and that gives us critical, high, medium, low, and informational for everything on our system. It also gives us a list of how to fix all those issues. We talked about virtualization, cloud, and distributed computing. We started out by talking about virtualization. That's where we have many servers, those are the clients, on the same hardware platform, that is the host. And there are a ton of benefits to virtualization. It's much cheaper, it's much easier to use, we use less cooling, we use less power, it has a much smaller footprint in our data center, and it's much easier to stand up new servers. It really just is create new server, choose the resources, choose the operating system, maybe load an image that we have already done, and within less than an hour, you have a new server. We can also allocate resources either dynamically or manually if a certain server needs more resources for a short amount of time. We talked about the different types of hypervisors, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is what we would have in our data center. This is hardware that's built specifically for virtualization. It has the hardware, and then it has the hypervisor, and on top of that we build all the virtual machines. This is also what all the cloud providers use. A type 2 hypervisor is what you and I would have on our own systems. I have my PC, I have my operating system on that, and then as an application on that operating system, I have a hypervisor. Using that hypervisor, I can then build virtual machines on my system. And then of course, virtualization comes with a whole new set of security concerns, things we need to think about before we deploy. We want a similar protection profile for all the systems on one host. So in the case there's VM escape, where an attacker can jump from one client to another, it's within the same trust level. Just like we did with single sign-on, there needs to be added security, because with single sign-on, now you just don't have access to one system, you have access to 20. The same thing here. If you gain access to the hypervisor, instead of having access to one server, you might have access to 500. And then of course, we need to keep a very close eye on the resources. It's very common for admins to oversubscribe them, or for the data owner to actually have access to allocate resources to their own servers. It's just a bad idea. Then we moved into cloud computing. We talked about how there is no cloud, it's just someone else's computer somewhere else. Just like there's no internet. It's just a bunch of connections between ISPs, WAN providers, and long-haul providers. And when we use cloud computing, we either build or outsource some parts of our IT infrastructure, storage, and applications. We talked about private and public cloud. Private, we own and run it on our own infrastructure. Public, this is shared tenancy, and this is what 99% of all cloud computing is. This is AWS, Google, IBM. They build massive infrastructures, and we rent a small part of that. Then we had hybrid cloud computing. That's a mix between private and public. The stuff that makes sense, we host in our own data center. Normally things where latency or higher security is important. And then everything else where it makes sense, we put on public cloud. And then finally, we had community cloud. And that really is used for a special community or customers from an organization that have a shared concern. That was the one where all the hospital systems and anyone in healthcare in Hawaii, they had a community cloud they can use for the projects they're working on together. Then the big part, the different types of public cloud. We talked about infrastructure as a service. The name kind of indicates what it is. The vendor is responsible for everything, including the virtualization. We put the operating system, the databases, the security, the applications on top of that. Then we had platform as a service. Here, we are only responsible for the applications and the data. And then finally, software as a service. Here, we are only responsible for the data. In many cases, these are vendor-specific applications. That was the one where I had the example with when we discharge patients from that hospital. We integrate our patient data with their application, and their application then does all the behind-the-scenes work. Then we talked about distributed systems, which often also is called distributed computing environments. That's where we move the system out as close as possible to the end user, regardless if it is a or a system. And we do that because it gives a better user experience. The latency is lower. It also gives us horizontal scaling, meaning if I have 7 and I want to expand to 20, I just add 13 systems more that are geographically dispersed depending on what I'm trying to achieve. It has a higher fault tolerance because if one of my 7 systems go down, I still have the other 6. It's cost effective, and it gives us that low latency that people expect online. And we really use it everywhere. It's the internet, it's websites, it's cell phone networks, it's research, it's peer-to-peer networks, it's blockchain, and thousands of other things. Then we talked about high-performance systems. The most well-known type here are supercomputers. We have built all these systems with the specs we need exactly for this one task. And then we have a user or a scheduler that controls all those systems. The important part here, just like with anything else we do with servers, is we need to have enough compute, network, and storage for whatever we're doing. They need to be aligned. And then finally, we talked about edge computing. Here, we bring the data as close as possible to wherever that data is needed, and we do that by moving the data and the compute resources. And this again here lowers the bandwidth use and it lowers the latency. With edge computing, the most commonly used type are CDNs. All CDNs are edge computing and distributed computing, but not all distributed or edge computing is CDNs. And I think close to 80% of large enterprises have already implemented or in the process of implementing edge computing in their organizations. IoT devices is anything smart. Garage doors, phones, TVs, air conditioners, whatever. When we buy them for our organization, we want to buy them from the vendor that actually releases security patches. We want devices that has some sort of security built in. And then we harden those devices, we remove all the defaults we can, we patch them, and we segment them off on their own network. We talked about asset tracking. We have a corporate asset tracking system. In that, we track all of our assets. For us, that is the IT stuff. And like we talked about in our risk analysis, we need to have identified all of our assets. If we don't know we have the asset, how can we possibly protect it? And then that asset has a life cycle. We track that asset from when we buy it till we discard it. And most of our assets have a tech refresh cycle. That could be a laptop. Every 4 years, the user gets a new laptop. And it's super critical that we update that asset tracking system and everything is entered. If we forget something, well then that is not protected. We can also use the asset tracking system to notify us whenever we're low on something, when we have this many laptops left, or we have this many hard drives left for that specific server. Then we talked about hardware hardening. Most people think servers when we talk about this, but it really is everything. It is routers, it is switches, firewalls, workstations, wireless access points, and obviously servers as well, and everything else we have in our organization that is IT. Hardware hardening should be as much as possible automated. If we have to harden 100 things and Bob has to do it manually, it's likely he forgets something. If we do it automatically, all 100 steps will get done. And that is deleting all the default user accounts, usernames, and passwords. We apply all the patches. We block all the ports that are not needed. We stop all the services that shouldn't run. We remove anything from that system that is not something we need. And then finally, we talked about how we can lock down the USB ports. If you think back to when we talked about the Stuxnet worm, if they had locked down the USB ports, then that engineer could not have brought in his USB stick, the plant would not have been infected. We talked about electricity. In our data center, we have to have clean, reliable power for our servers, disk arrays, and networking equipment. If we have a loss of power, it will definitely affect our availability and it can affect our integrity. For that, we use UPSs, uninterruptible power supplies. Those are the large battery banks. We use PDUs. They are the power distribution units. And then we have transfer switches and we have backup generators. The transfer switch just keeps an eye on, do we get enough power from the power company? If not, it should start the generator. The UPS really does nothing. It just sits there and waits until we don't have enough power. Then the battery starts discharging. Once the generator starts, the batteries stop sending power because the systems already get it from the generator and the battery starts recharging. And for everything that we have, including power, we want full redundancy. So each server is connected to 2 different power outlets that are connected to 2 different PDUs that are connected to 2 different UPSs, to 2 different transfer switches, and if at all possible, to 2 different utility providers. The generators can technically run as long as we have fuel for them. Some places I have worked, we have had 10,000 gallon tanks, which should be able to last us weeks. And then we talked about the power fluctuation terms. A blackout is a long loss of power completely. A fault is a short amount of loss of power. The power is still completely out. Then we had a brownout and a sag. A brownout is a long period of low voltage. A sag is a short period of low voltage. A surge is a high period of high voltage. And a spike is a short period of high voltage. And while we want, of course, to have battery enough for our entire organization, this is mostly centered around our data centers. It's an inconvenience convenience, I can use my desktop, but if the data center is down, the entire organization is down. We talked about backups. So we started out talking a little bit about fault tolerance and how on critical systems we have as much redundancy and resiliency as it makes sense. Now, if that fails, or we get hacked, or the data center is destroyed, then and only then do we need our backups. And backups are super critically important. Remember, 72% of businesses that had major data loss were closed within 2 years. We have 4 different types of backups that we use. We have full backups, incremental, differential, and copy backups. And then depending on the system we have and the legal requirements we need to adhere to, in most places I have worked, we have had 3 months retention, 6 months, 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, 7 years, and infinity. And yes, infinity means we keep it forever. And while it would be easier to do full backups of everything every time, it's both going to take much longer. It's also going to use much more backup media. That can either be tapes or disk. But if we have to restore, it's also going to be faster because we just need single tape. Since that's not always feasible, we can do incremental backups. And incremental backups backs up everything that was changed since the last backup, and it clears the archive bit, just like the full backup does. But that was the one where if the system crashes on day 30, we might need 29 tapes to restore the data. Then we had differential backups, and that backs up everything since the last full or incremental backup, which is the last time the flag was cleared. This is going to take more storage space, it's going to take more time, but it's still better than a full backup. If on day 30 again here, we need to restore, well then we need 2 tapes. The original full backup and then the differential tape from just before the crash. And then finally we had the copy backup. It is exactly like a full backup, but it doesn't clear the archive bit. That is what we use when we do patches or system updates. We need to be able to restore the system, but we don't want to mess with the backup cycle. We talked about fault tolerance, redundancy, and resiliency. We started out by talking about RAID, redundant array of independent disks. Here we have 2 basic forms. We have disk mirroring, we mirror the data, and we have disk striping, we split the data out over multiple disks. With disk mirroring, if we have 2 hard drives and we mirror the data to those 2, if one dies, we still have all of the data on the second drive. But this is also slower because we need to write it twice. This is for redundancy and fault tolerance. Then we have disk striping. Here we write the data across multiple disks. We have to use at least 2. So the first part of the data is written on disk 1, the second part on disk 2, the third part on disk 3. This is only for speed. We can, however, with disk striping use parity and then use that parity to restore data so we both get the faster write speed and we also get the redundancy, the resiliency, the fault tolerance. I think you need to know RAID 0, that is striping with no mirroring and no parity. There's no fault tolerance. The only thing it does is it gives us faster read and write speeds, and we need at least 2 disks. RAID 1, that is the mirroring we talked about. We need at least 2 disks, and we write the identical data to all the disks. Then we have RAID 5, that is plug level striping with distributed parity. And it's called distributed because the parity is on different disks. So for the A data stream, the parity is on disk 4. For the B data stream, it's on disk 3. If any of those disks die, we can restore the data from the 3 remaining disks. Then we talked about data center and system redundancy. We have multiple power supplies that on their own can carry the whole system in a server. We have multiple network connections that go to redundant switches, that go to redundant routers, that go to redundant internet providers. On newer physical servers, many of the parts and all of the moving ones are hot swappable, meaning we can pull them out and replace them while the server is still up. That is the power supplies because they have the little fans in them. That is the fans throughout the motherboard and their chassis, and it is all the hard drives. But we also need that redundancy in our data center. We can't have that single point of failure. We talked about how we need to design our data center for future use, not current use. And pretty much all of my bad data center stories all tie back to us designing it poorly. We didn't anticipate our growth. Now, if we have collected our data, we can see our growth over time. We can also predict to a certain extent of certainty where we will be in 5 years and in 10 years. We don't build the data center for our current needs. We build it for our predicted future needs. Then we talked about how we can also have redundant servers. They can be in a full mesh, like we talked about in the networking portion, and they can either be in an active-active pair or primary-primary, or an active-passive pair or primary-secondary. you will hear those terms used interchangeably. If it is an active-active pair, well then data is sent and handled on both systems. If it is an active-passive pair, then there's one server handling the traffic. The secondary server just gets all the data and it sends the key blibes every second. If the primary server misses 3 key blibes, the secondary server takes over. And then finally, we talked about database shadowing. We have an exact real-time copy of the database saved somewhere else. It doesn't have to be geographically distant, but it should be. Then we had e-vaulting or electronic vaulting. Here we send the backups offsite at a certain interval, let's say every 15 minutes, regardless of what changed, or we can choose to back up every time there's a change to these files. And then finally we had remote journaling. Here we send the log files offsite, but only the log files. Using those log files, we can rebuild all the transactions. We talked about the fire triangle. To put a fire out, we can remove any of the 3 legs: oxygen, heat, or fuel. In most of the cases, we remove the oxygen, and in some cases, we remove the heat. The fuel is whatever's burning, so if it's in our data center, that would be the servers or the equipment. That's pretty hard to remove. So in our data center, to remove the oxygen, we replace some of the oxygen in the room with another gas. But we only replace enough to put the fire out and make sure it doesn't kill people. And here we can use halon or FM200 or argon. We can also, with a fire extinguisher, remove possibly both oxygen and heat if we spray that fire extinguisher right at the server. Then we talked a little bit about the fire classes. And while this is an international certification, for questions like this, if you get anything on fire suppression and fire classes, answer it from an American point of view. For your work, know the fire classes where you live. So Class A is ordinary combustibles. When they burn, they turn to ash, so use that for your mnemonic. Class B is flammable liquids and gases. Think of liquids as being a barrel. Class B for barrel. Then Class C is electrical equipment. Think of C as in current, as in the electricity we use for those systems. Class D were the combustible metals. Since they're combustible, think of dynamite, it combusts. And then finally, Class K, that is cooking oils or fats, K for kitchen. Then we talked about how in all of our building we would have sprinklers. Each sprinkler head has a little glass bulb that once it reaches a certain temperature, that bulb breaks, what comes out. Now in the rest of the building, perfectly fine, not a problem. But in the data center, that needs to be the very, very last resort. Because when you put water on your hardware, it's completely dead. That is just in hardware, millions and millions of dollars. We use sprinkler systems in the data center when the data center is lost and we need to preserve the building. And that's of course only after the main fire suppression, whatever gases we have failed. In the rest of the building, not the data center, we would have wet pipe, meaning that there's water all the way up to the sprinkler head. As soon as the glass bulb in the sprinkler head breaks, water comes out. In the data center, we have dry pipe, meaning 100 or argon. We can also, with a fire extinguisher, remove possibly both oxygen and heat if we spray that fire extinguisher right at the server. Then we talked a little bit about the fire classes. And while this is an international certification, for questions like this, if you get anything on fire suppression and fire classes, answer it from an American point of view. For your work, know the fire classes where you live. So Class A is ordinary combustibles. When they burn, they turn to ash, so use that for your mnemonic. Class B is flammable liquids and gases. Think of liquids as being in a barrel. Class B for barrel. Then Class C is electrical equipment. Think of C as in current, as in the electricity we use for those systems. Class D were the combustible metals. Since they're combustible, think of dynamite, it combusts. And then finally, Class K, that is cooking oils or fats, K for kitchen. Then we talked about how in all of our building we would have sprinklers. Each sprinkler head has a little glass bulb that once it reaches a certain temperature, that bulb breaks, water comes out. Now in the rest of the building, perfectly fine, not a problem. But in the data center, that needs to be the very, very last resort. Because when you put water on your hardware, it's completely dead. That is just in hardware, millions and millions of dollars. We use sprinkler systems in the data center when the data center is lost and we need to preserve the building. And that's of course only after the main fire suppression, whatever gases we have failed. In the rest of the building, not the data center, we would have wet pipe, meaning that there's water all the way up to the sprinkler head. As soon as the glass bulb in the sprinkler head breaks, water comes out. In the data center, we have dry pipe, meaning there's compressed air in the pipe and someone has to push a button to release the water. We don't want this to happen by mistake. And then when we use the fire extinguishers, we use the pass method. We pull the pin, we aim at the base of the fire, we squeeze the handle slowly, and then we sweep from side to side. We talked about secure defaults, and that is basically the system being locked down as much as possible as soon as we pull it out of the box. So all the ports are locked down, all the default accounts are removed, it's patched, it's as secure as possible. It's also unusable because everything is locked down. We then do some tests for usability, and using those tests and using our risk assessments, we open up for exactly what we need for that server or that application to do its job, no more. This is least privilege. If at any point that changes, the application or the server needs more access, well then we go through proper change control and we open up only for those new things. Again, new least privilege. Then we talked about fail secure or fail closed. That is what we want our firewall to do. If the firewall gets overwhelmed, it shuts down, it blocks traffic. The system, when it fails, should stay at least as secure as it was before the failure. And then the other side of that is fail open or fail safe. That is what we want our doors to do when there's a fire. They should open up and let everybody out of the building so we don't risk people's lives. I have had a few students who struggle with secure and safe. I mean, it's really in the word, right? We want to be secure or we want to be safe. Safe is safe evacuation. Secure is our systems. Talked a little bit about, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have very technical, very complex solutions, but they only should be as complex as they need to be. Us overcomplicating things is going to make it much harder for us to manage, to configure, and to troubleshoot. And this is the same thing with everything else, right? Exactly enough security, no more, no less. Exactly enough complex, no more, no less. Then we talked about trust but verify, which is what we have been doing for many years. You have your username, your password, and then some sort of token. Using that multi-factor authentication will give you access to where you have rights for. But once you have gained access, we don't ever check you again, which then prompted the move towards zero trust, never trust, always verify. And this is a move that's happening because most of the large, very serious compromises happens using admin accounts. Again here, once the account is compromised, the attacker has access. They have access to everything that account can access. With zero trust, we don't trust anyone, and I mean anyone. We don't trust the users on our network. We don't trust our own systems, even if they have been verified. So whenever I need to access something on our network, I need to both authenticate and authorize, and the server does as well. Once that session is over, if I try to access that resource again, I need to re-verify. Then we talked a little bit about privacy by design. With privacy, we need to be proactive, not reactive. Privacy should be a default setting. We should embed it into our design. Just like we have security designed in, we should also have privacy designed in. With everything really, we should have end-to-end security, but it's even more important with privacy by design. Then we should have a great degree of visibility and transparency. That means that we protect and handle the information, and we're subject to independent verification. And then, of course, finally, we have the respect for user privacy. We have the strong privacy defaults. We have the appropriate notices for users. We keep it as user-friendly and as user-centric as possible. And then finally, we talked about shared responsibility. That is for cloud computing, and that's just us being very clear on who are responsible for the security on which part of cloud computing. And that, of course, depends on which type of cloud computing we have. But also here, if the cloud provider has turned on security and we choose to turn it off, even if it is in part of their responsibility, we still turn it off. It is our responsibility. And with that, we are done with the Domain 4 recap. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next lecture. In this video, we're going to do a recap of all the topics we covered in Domain 5. You can use it as a recap for your notes when you're working on practice questions for the day before the exam or whatever else you need. Alright, let's recap. So whenever we build new systems, we buy new systems, most of them are going to be completely open. So we need to do that server hardening we talked about. We shut down all the ports that we don't need. We remove the default account. We apply all the patches. We disable any service that we don't need. Then we run a vulnerability scan against that system to make sure we got everything. And all the server hardening or the device hardening should really happen automatically. We don't trust Bob to do all 100 things. It's more likely we get everything done if this is automated. Then once the system is inserted into our production environment, we start monitoring it, and we start monitoring for all the changes. If anyone makes changes outside of our security baseline, we get notified because only changes that have been approved in our change control should be made to the system and not just some admin that has a problem that needs to fix it quickly. And we keep monitoring the security baseline for any of our systems until we retire them. This is for the entire lifecycle of that one system. We talked about patch management. Whenever most vendors discover software vulnerabilities in their software, they try to fix that, and they do that by releasing patches. Whenever a patch is released, we should implement it to our systems within a reasonable amount of time. Now, what that is depends on what we're patching. In most places, I would say within a couple of weeks. We shouldn't do what Equifax did, where they waited more than 2 months. Had they patched their systems in those 2 months, they would never have been breached. On Microsoft systems, it's Patch Tuesday. The second Tuesday of every month, there's going to be new patches. We deploy those patches to our test environment. We see if it breaks anything. We have our users test all the applications and the regular functionality and see if anything has been impacted by applying this patch. For something as big as Microsoft, they also have emergency patches, and that's for anything that's critical enough that it can't wait until Patch Tuesday. Here, they do out-of-cycle patches. And it really is important that we patch everything. We don't just only patch the servers. We patch our storage array, our networking equipment, our VM hosts, anything we have that's IoT, workstations, phones, really anything that we can patch needs to be patched if there's a new patch out for it. And like with most other things, we want to automate as much as possible so we don't have that human error. So for our patches, or really for any software push, we use something like a CCM or WSUS. That way, the patches are going to get pushed out to every single system. We don't miss some because whomever is pushing the patches out is tired or just forgets about a segment. We would normally do patches starting at maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. That way the systems have had enough time to finish their backup, and then we probably shouldn't go much past 5 in the morning. Because if we have to do some troubleshooting, we don't really have a lot of time before staff starts coming in at 7 or 8 in the morning. We can also, if we look at the Microsoft patches, but really this is true for anything. We can look at all the things to fix in this patch and then pick the ones that are appropriate for us. If there's nothing critical, well, maybe we only do some of the patches, some of the updates, because we might not have whatever the rest are for in our environment. If we don't have that system or that type of configuration, there's no point in applying that patch. And then with any change in our environment, patches included, we go through proper change control. And we do that after we have tested the patch. We go in and tell them, when we apply this patch, this is what we're changing. This is what we're going to get out of it. This is what's going to happen if we don't make that change. Here's the impact of the patch, and here is our rollback plan. And then when and if the change control board approves the patch, well, then we apply it in the specific window for that patch that we have been given by the change control board. We talked about change management, and change management is our formalized process. We handle any change to our environment. That can be configuration changes, patch management, it doesn't really matter. It's a change in our environment. And we need to go through that process for everything that we change. For our changes, we have a change review board. And that's made up both by IT, because we understand what that change is going to do, but also the operational units that this change is going to affect as well. On top of that, we also have subboards, technical approval boards, change approval boards, or whatever we need. We clearly communicate to the users that are using these systems, why are we making this change, what is it going to get us, what is it going to get us if we don't, and that's really the same thing we use for the change control board. This is why we're doing this patch, this is all the good stuff we're going to get if we do, this is all the bad stuff that potentially could happen if we don't. This is how we're going to back out if for some reason it doesn't work. And then on our change control board, we don't normally have senior management on those boards, but we probably have a certain set of parameters. Anything within those we can approve without senior management, but if it's something where the impact can be really grave, here we might need their approval. There are a ton of different frameworks that we can use for change management. Which one we choose really depends on the needs of our organization. What do we need? What kind of infrastructure do we have? What kind of business are we in? And many other things. The flow in most of them are going to be the same. Some of them are just specialized in this type of environment or this line of business. And then assuming we implement the change, we're successful, then we monitor the change, and then we report on what went well and what did not. And we do that again not to lay blame, but to be more successful and have a better implementation next time. As part of us testing the change, we need to be aware that in most places, test and production environments are not identical. So when we deploy the change, the results might also be different. And when we have implemented, us implementing whatever change can have opened new risks that will be residual risks that we then may need to mitigate. And then, of course, we need to have proper documentation and records for everything that we do. Both so we can go back and audit, also so whomever is working on this next time, they can go in and very clearly see what you did and why you did it. And then, of course, know the difference between change management and change control. Change management is everything. Change control is controlling the change. Makes sense, right? And then finally, we talked about PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. And really here, it's the same flow as in any of the other frameworks. We request the change, we analyze it, we get approval, we plan the implementation, we communicate, we implement and test. If we are successful, we communicate that. If we're not, we do a rollback and communicate that. And then finally, we have acceptance. Once the change is accepted, we do our lessons learned. We talked about cryptography. We started out with a history of cryptography, and yes, this can be testable. We had the Spartan sidetail. That was the one where we wrapped a piece of cloth around a stick. That stick was our secret key. We then wrote a message across the cloth, removed the stick, sent the cloth to the receiver, and they would then use a stick of exactly the same diameter to read the text. Even if that cloth was intercepted, unless they used a stick with exactly the same diameter, they couldn't read the text. Then we had the Caesar cipher. That was the substitution cipher. We just moved the letters a certain amount to the left or to the right in the alphabet. Then we talked a little bit about how most people think that cryptography is only about keeping our secret secret, but it can also give us integrity, authentication, and non-repudiation. And of course here, we use strong enough encryption that it shouldn't be breakable within a reasonable amount of time. Now how long that is and how strong that is depends on what we are protecting. Then we talked about some definitions. Cryptology, that is the science of securing communication. Cryptography, that is us creating messages where the meaning is hidden, they are encrypted. Cryptanalysis is the science of breaking that secured communication. And then the cipher is the actual cryptographic algorithm. We also had the plaintext or the clear text, that is the unencrypted message. That's the one that you and I can read. The ciphertext is the encrypted message. That's the one we send that the receiver then decrypts. Encryption is converting the plaintext into the ciphertext. Decryption is converting the ciphertext back into plaintext. Then we talked about a book cipher. That's the one where we have the same book in the same version. And then you go to page 244, line 12, word 3, and so on. We've all seen that in the movies, right? Then we have a run key cipher. If I have a whole letter I'm going to write to you, and let's say that phrase that we agree upon is 15 letters. Once those 50 letters are used up, they just start over. And it's basically just addition. I take the number value of my letter and I add it to that letter of that phrase, scrambling the letters. You then do the same in reverse. We talked about how we have used symmetric encryption for thousands of years, and with symmetric encryption, we need a key pair for everybody who needs to talk. If it is only 2 people, well then we need 1 key. We share that key. If it is 10 people, we need 45 keys. If it is 500 people, then we need 124,750. So the larger amount of people that need to talk with a symmetric key, it's going to be an insane amount of keys. 10,000 people, almost 50 million keys. Whereas with symmetric encryption, each person or each entity just needs 2 keys, the private key and the public key. The public key is shared with the public, everybody can get it. The private key is kept as secure as possible. Now how we use the public key and the private key depends on what we're trying to achieve. If it's confidentiality, well then when I send you a message, I encrypt it with your public key, because you are the only one who has the private key. You are the only one who can decrypt. If you want to reply to me, you encrypt the message, the reply, with my public key. Since I am the only one who has my private key, I am the only one who can read that message. But we can also use this for digital signatures. And here the purpose is entirely different. We want authenticity and we want non-repudiation. We want to make sure that the message is authentic, and we want to make sure that the sender is who they say they are. So here we do it in reverse. When I send data to you, I encrypt it with my private key. That can be decrypted with my public key that everybody has, but it has to have originated from me, because I am the only one who has my private key. I am the only one who can encrypt with that. But again here, the point is not confidentiality. It is authenticity and it is non-repudiation. But we can, if we want, get both. In that scenario, again here, I encrypt it with my private key, so we know the data came from me. But if I only want you to read that message, I encrypt the ciphertext that I already encrypted with my private key. I encrypt that again with your public key, meaning only you can decrypt that. That way, we get the authenticity, we get non-repudiation, but we also get confidentiality. And with most of what we do on the internet, we use hybrid encryption. We use both symmetric and asymmetric encryption. Symmetric encryption is much faster. Asymmetric encryption is much slower, but we can send that shared key that we need for the symmetric encryption over an unsecured medium, the internet. And we can't do that with symmetric. So we use asymmetric, the one with the private and public key, to get the shared secret from me to you. That is the key for the symmetric encryption. And then once that is exchanged, we switch to the symmetric encryption because we both have the key now. We send the data much faster, and depending on how long the session is, every so often, we might send a new session key over asymmetric just to make sure that our session is still secure. We talked about hash functions, and they are one-way functions, meaning they only work one way. You can't take the hash and then get the original plaintext. And we only use it for integrity. The keywords here were it's a variable length plaintext that is hashed into a fixed length hash. So it doesn't matter if it's 20 letters or 20,000 letters, the output, the hash, is whatever length we choose. With hashes, we can have collisions, and that is when two different plaintexts produces the same hash. It is very unlikely unless there's a flaw in the algorithm, but it is possible. And then we had the example with the first chapter of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. I did a hash on the original text, then I deleted a comma, the hash changed completely. Then instead of deleting the comma, I put a period, and again here, the hash changed completely. With the hash, we have no clue what changed. We just know something was changed. And we can use that when we download software online. If we want to make sure this is the original software, we can compare whatever we downloaded to the original. We can also use it in our digital forensics. If a system was compromised, we do a hash of the compromised drive, then we do a bit-level copy of that drive. We do a hash on the copy. If they match, well then they are identical. Then we do our forensics on the copy drive, and then when we're done, we do another hash to make sure we didn't anything. And then I don't need to know the hashing algorithms, but maybe just recognize them, MD5 or SHA-2 or 3. We talked about cryptographic attacks. We started out with steal the key. It is much easier to steal the key than it is to break the actual encryption. Now, how they steal that really depends on our implementation. If we have a weak server where we store all of our private keys, if the attacker can gain access to that, they now have access to everything. Then we talked about brute force attacks. Those are the ones that uses the entire key space, and every single form of encryption can be broken using brute force, but in most cases it doesn't really matter because it can take hundreds or thousands of years. To mitigate some of that, we can implement something where if you type your password wrong 5 times, well then your account is locked. Or we can add key stretching. Every time we verify a password, it takes 1 or 2 seconds. Since a brute force attack needs millions and millions of attempts, it's no longer a feasible attack vector. Then we talked about man-in-the-middle attacks. Those are the one where 2 parties think they're having a private conversation, but someone has inserted themselves in the middle and they're relaying all the information. They can either send the original information back and forth, or they can change it for whatever they want. That's the one where Bob is trying to send $1 million to John, but Mike, who's in the middle of that conversation, switches out the account number. He now gets that $1 million. And then finally, we talked about side channel attacks. That's where we learned something that we shouldn't be able to from some sort of misconfiguration or access they shouldn't have. That was the one where if both the username and password is wrong, it takes 3 seconds, but if the username is right and it actually goes in to see is this the right password, well then it takes 6 seconds. We now know this is a valid username. And I have to be honest here, there are of course many different types of attacks on our cryptography that we didn't cover here. But for the exam, these are the ones I think you need to know about. We talked about data handling, data storage, and data retention. Data handling is an administrative control, meaning we only want the individuals who should have access to the data also to handle it. We have those very clear policies on who can access the data, why, when, where, how. And this is with need to know. You have to have a need to know to access the data. We then have the auditing and the logs in place, so after the fact we can make sure you had a good need to know. In the perfect world, we have some sort of backend IT audit system that does that for us. When we talk about backup tapes, they should be kept at a secure, climate-controlled, and preferably somewhat geographically distant location. We want it close enough for when we need to restore, it doesn't take a lot of time to get the tapes, but we also want it far enough away that if we have a disaster, they're not affected by the same disaster. Now, how far away that is really depends on our MTD, our maximum tolerable downtime. If our MTD is 4 hours and it's going to take us 4 hours to get the tapes, well then we can't restore in time. For most of our backups, we use storage tapes. They are relatively inexpensive, they can hold a ton of data, and they're easy to store. The LTO tapes are what we mostly use. The latest version I worked with, I think, was LTO-8s. One of those can have 12 terabyte of data, and if we compress it, we're up to 30 terabyte. That is a ton of data for a small tape that is no more than 4 by 4 inches or 10 by 10 centimeters. We of course need to have that proper storage of the tapes. That means that they are not stored under someone's bed at their house. They're not just in some random closet wherever we have space, and they're definitely not on the floor in the data center like the example I had from Hawaii. Because what if something happened and the backups that we store that data with, they're all in the data center. If that's destroyed, well then everything is gone. And when we talk about protecting data, that's data in any form. It's not just the backup tapes or the disks. It's in paper, it's in audio. So with much of the data we have, it's going to have certain retention requirements. That means how long do we need to keep that data for? Some of the examples that I have used from healthcare or from banking, we could have 7 years. For 7 years, we have to keep this data. And since it would not be feasible to do that on disk, whenever we do a full backup of, let's say, payroll records, then we keep that for 7 years. And since we do that backup every week, we're going to have 52 tapes for every year times 7, just for that one system. We send that tape off to the facility, and in most cases, that tape just sits there for 7 years. After the 7 years have passed, we get the tape back. At that point, the tape is too old. We can't really reuse it because it's old technology, so we destroy it. Now, the more we destroy it, the less chance we have of data being recovered. But that's also going to be more expensive. So we choose the right type of disposal. But if you remember back to when we talked about threats, 6% of all threats are from lost or improper disposal. Out of our internal threats, that is almost 20%. So for paper records, if there's potential for anything incriminating, anything sensitive, they need to be destroyed, and that should be cross-threaded, not just single-thread. We can either do it ourselves or we can pay someone to do it. With digital media, we can do the same, right? We can shred the drives, we can crush them, we can technically pour acid on them or something weird like that, but in most cases, it's going to be overwriting all the data with ones and zeros. That obviously assumes that we can write to all the sectors. Then we can do a full encryption of the drive. While that doesn't delete anything, it makes it less likely for the attacker to break the encryption. We can DGOS the spinning disks or really anything where the data is stored magnetically. And that was the one that was just a giant electromagnetic field that makes changes in the magnetic charges on the drives. Think of it like the hacker throwing the hard drive in the microwave, just much stronger. And of course here we have the proper destruction for whatever we're protecting. If there's no sensitive data on that drive, maybe we just do a full disk encryption and DDoS it or crush it or something else. If this is top secret, well maybe here we do the purge, then we do the DDoSing, and then we use the shredder. Most of those by themselves should be enough, but having them all combined would make it probably impossible to retrieve that data again. We talked about administrative or directive controls. Those are our policies and our procedures. Many people don't think they are as important as the technical or physical controls. I think they're maybe even more important because we use them to design the technical and physical controls. We talked a little bit about the different control types. Preventative, it prevents something from happening. Detective, we detect something during or after an attack. Corrective, it corrects something. Recovery, helps us recover after an attack. Deterrent, it deters an attack, it doesn't stop it, but it makes it less likely to happen. And then finally, compensating controls. Those are the controls we implement when none of the other controls are feasible. They are either physically impossible, they're too expensive, it's just something we can't or won't do. Then we implement compensating controls to get the security posture that we need. Then we talked about our policies, how they are mandatory and they are high level, and they're built on all of the stuff on top of the policies in orange here in this pyramid. So we have our mission, we have our vision, we have our values. Using that, we build our objectives. Using those, we build our IT strategy. Using those, we build our IT and cybersecurity strategy. And using that, we build our security policies. We have to have all the stuff above before we do the security policies. We can't just implement security policies if we don't have a strategy. And then we talked a little bit about some specific policies. the acceptable use policy. What is acceptable use of our network, the data, and our resources? This is a piece of paper that employees sign before they gain access to anything. Then we talked about BYOD, where employees can bring their own devices in. We segment that network off. We give it probably somewhat limited access. And then depending on our organization, we may or may not support their devices. If they want to bring their own stuff in, the support is on themselves. We touched on privacy policies, which is how we gather, use, disclose, and manage private data. And that is both for internal employees and it is for our customers. We may have separate policies for the two. Then we talked about password policies. That could be saying that the password management system remembers the last 24 passwords. We have to change our passwords every 90 days. A password has to be at least 2 days old before we can change it. It has to have a certain amount of characters. It has to have complex passwords, meaning the uppercase, lowercase, number, and symbol. And then we store passwords in a non-reversible encryption form. That is hashing. Remember, it's a one-way function, variable length plaintext, fixed length output. And then we talked about how we can have a data handling policy, how we classify, how we categorize, label, store, encrypt, backup, and destroy our data. And then finally, we talked about the 3 different states of data, because the different states of data needs different protection. Data at rest, that is stored data, that is tape drives, disk, but it's not actively being used. Here we use encryption. Data in motion, it's being transferred over a network. If I'm sending you a file, we want end-to-end encryption, meaning it gets encrypted on my device, it gets decrypted on yours. Anywhere where that data traverses a network, even if the attacker was able to get that traffic, they can't decrypt it. And then finally, we have data in use. It's actively being used, we can't encrypt. So here we have our policies, we have outlines for what is acceptable. So we have the clean desk policy, we have the print policy, we have the no shoulder serving policy. And then with those policies in place, we raise the security level of data in use to an acceptable level. We talked about how we give the users the right training so we can raise their awareness so we can change their behavior. For that, we need both the completely right training. It needs to be not boring, there needs to be some sort of engagement, and we can use gamification. That's where we turn it into a game. There are some sort of rewards if they do well. That can be during or after the training event. Whomever can answer the questions right gets some sort of reward. And then a couple of weeks later, if this was on phishing, we can send a phishing email out. The team or the top teams where the highest percentage of their team members reported that phishing email to security, they get some sort of reward. Most places think that their employees are the biggest asset, which I think is excellent, but it is also the biggest risk. So we need to give them that right training. And it really does work with gamification. Our employees are our first layer of defense. And if we do it right, we can build that good cybersecurity culture where we have proper cyber hygiene. We talked about social engineering, and that is really just using your people skills to bypass our security controls. And we can do this in combination with many other attacks, but it is often the first attack vector, and it is most often also the easiest. And social engineering is successful for a bunch of reasons. People want to be helpful, they don't want to get in trouble, they would want someone else to help them if they were in a similar situation. And if we are doing social engineering, a mix of these approaches can help. That can be authority. That is either someone that you think you trust or someone that you're afraid of. That could be a person in a suit that looks like a CEO. Or it can be a cop uniform. This is over the phone or in an email, well then they still present some sort of authority. Then we have intimidation. If you don't do what I tell you to do, something bad is going to happen. That's your system is going to stay infected, your credit card is going to be misused, your company is going to have a lawsuit, you intimidate your victim into doing something. Then we have consensus, that is following the crowd. That can be fake reviews on a website, or it could be the social engineering, the penetration testing they did with that ice cream van, but everybody else was doing it. We can also use scarcity. If you don't act now, we're going to run out because we only have 200 left. And this type of attack really amuses me when it's online content, something digital, because we're never going to run out. Then we can also use urgency, that is the buy now in the next 24 hours before the sale closes, or fill these papers out before Friday, or we're going to sue you for $1 million. It has to happen right now. Then we have familiarity. We have some sort of common ground. We build on that. We went to the same high school, we know the same friends, and since we kind of sort of know each other, it's probably okay for me to give the attacker my information. Then we talked about phishing, regular phishing, using millions and millions of emails out, and even if one person replies and gives you their money, the attack is successful. Then we had spear phishing, It is a targeted attack, just like the familiarity. You write them by name. You have some sort of common reference, or at least you know something about your target, so you can write an email specifically to them. And then the last type of phishing is whale phishing. Here, we target someone in the senior leadership team in the company. First off, they have a ton of access. Secondly, they might not be very tech savvy. Then we talk about phishing, voice phishing, and that really can be all three types too. It can be the automated phone calls that calls 1,000 or 10,000 people. They're normally not very phishing. We can also have the spear and the whale variety. And again here, it's just targeting one because we're never going to count. Then we can also that is in the next 24 hours before the sale closes. Biggest asset, which I think is excellent, but it is also the biggest risk. So we need to give them that right training, and it really does work with gamification. These are our first layer of defense, and if we do, we can build a good cybersecurity culture where we have proper cyber hygiene. We talked about social engineering, and that is really just using your people skills to bypass our security controls. And we can do this in combination with many other attacks, but it is often the first attack vector, and it is most often also the easiest. Social engineering is successful for a bunch of reasons. People want to be helpful, they don't want to get in trouble, they would want someone else to help them if they were in a similar situation. And if we are doing social engineering, a mix of these approaches can help. That can be authority. That is either someone that you think you should trust or someone that you're afraid of. That could be a person in a suit that looks like a CEO, or it can be someone in a cop uniform. Now, if this is over the phone or in an email, well then they still present some sort of authority. Then we have intimidation. If you don't do what I tell you to do, something bad is going to happen. That's your system is going to stay infected, your credit card is going to be misused, your company is going to have a lawsuit, you intimidate your victim into doing something. Then that is following the crowd. That can be fake reviews on a website, or it could be the social engineering, the penetration testing they did with that ice cream van, but everybody else was doing it. We can also use scarcity. If you don't act now, we're going to run out because we only have 200 left. And this type of attack really amuses me when it's online content, something digital, because we're never going to run out. Then we can also use urgency, that is the buy now in the next 24 hours before the sale closes, or fill these papers out before Friday, or we're going to sue you for $1 million. It has to happen right now. Then we have familiarity. We have some sort of common ground. We build on that. We went to the same high school, we know the same friends, and since we kind of sort of know each other, it's probably okay for me to give the attacker my information. Then we talked about phishing, regular phishing. You send millions and millions of emails out, and even if one person replies and gives you their money, the attack is successful. Then we had spear phishing. It is a targeted attack, just like the familiarity. You write them by name. You have some sort of common reference, or at least you know something about your target, so you can write an email specifically to them. And then the last type of phishing is whale phishing. Here, we target someone company. First off, they have not be very tech savvy. Then we talked about phishing, voice phishing, and that really can be all three types too. It can be the automated phone calls that calls 1,000 or 10,000 people. They're normally not very well crafted. They're not very likely to succeed. But again here, if just one person replies back, you may get $1 million. With the phishing, we can also have the spear and the whale variety. Again here, it's just targeting one person with specific details, or it's targeting someone in senior leadership. And with that, we are done with the Domain 5 recap. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next lecture.